Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more identified does. Let's get into it. Number 3. Mojave Jane Doe. January 23, 1971, 3 hunters making their way down the Hackesbury Road in a remote part of Mojave County, Arizona, near U.S. Highway 93, made a startling discovery. One of the 3 men had seen something that had caught his eye just off the dirt road. In the distance lay a white canvas sack that had been tied at the top with rope. Something about the bag immediately unsettled the men, and they decided to take a closer look. Upon inspection, the bag read, "Deer Pack Ames Harris Neville Co., and something was inside. When they opened the bag, they found the body of a young woman. Horrified, the 3 men rushed back to their car, flagged down the first available officer, and within hours, the once quiet dirt road was now swarming with Mojave County Sheriff's Office investigators. Her body and the woven sack that she'd been found in were photographed and then transported to the closest coroner's office for autopsy. In the report, the coroner noted that the body belonged to a white female between the ages of 35 and 50, brown curly hair, and was about 125 to 140 pounds. It was also noted that the woman had an indentation on her left ring finger, possibly indicating that she had worn a wedding band or an engagement ring, and that she had a long scar on her abdomen. The scar possibly indicated to the coroner that the woman had given birth via cesarean section at least once in her life. This woman perhaps had a husband and children who would come looking for her, but this would later prove to be wrong. The report also detailed that her fingernails were meticulously manicured, and that she was found wearing a size 14 long-sleeve shirt, black long-sleeved cardigan sweater, a size 12 burnt orange stretch pants, black leather ankle boots, and white socks. She had also undergone extensive and expensive dental work, with experts estimating that in 1971, these procedures would have cost around $2,000, or around $15,000 in today's dollars. This type of dental work was rare at the time and was reserved for those with money and access to good medical and dental care. With no immediate leads, investigators pinned their hopes on the woman's distinctive dental. Her dental x-rays were published in papers and dental journals across the U.S., hoping a dentist would recognize their handiwork, but no one came forward. After months with no one stepping forward to claim this woman, the Mojave County Sheriff's Department called her the Mojave Jane Doe. The coroner had ruled her passing a homicide and deemed that she had died due to strangulation. Multiple efforts were made to identify her, with her fingerprints being sent to the FBI and the Museum of North Arizona using her skull to create a composite sketch, but all of these efforts fell flat. Investigators could not believe that a woman who possibly had a husband and children could remain unclaimed. Months slowly turned into years, and the Mojave Jane Doe case turned cold. Investigators never gave up hope. In 1971, DNA analysis was another 10 years away. However, investigators ensured to preserve as much evidence as they could. This would come in handy many years down the line. The Mojave County Sheriff's Department left no stone unturned in this investigation. According to reports, they followed up on missing person reports from Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah, checked hospitals, motels, hotels, and stores, and broadcasted sketches of Jane Doe across the states. In 2021, the Mojave Jane Doe was finally added to the NamUs database. The case found renewed interest thanks to the entry, and in 2022, the Mojave County Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram Labs. Othram Incorporated, based in Texas, offered genetic genealogy services to governmental organizations. In 2022, they worked with the Mojave County Sheriff's Office to obtain a DNA sample from the Jane Doe. There was only one major issue that Othram faced, was funding. The true crime community responded astoundingly, and the $6,500 needed to fund the DNA sequencing was raised in just 5 days. In January 2023, the long-awaited announcement from Othram was finally made, and the Mojave Jane Doe was identified as Colleen Audrey Rice. Colleen was born on March 17, 1931 in Portsmouth, Ohio, to James C. Rice and Flossie Truitt. In 1946, she married William Davis and became estranged from her family soon after finishing Portsmouth High School. Investigators could not determine whether Colleen had ever given birth, as no birth records had been recovered. The Mohave County Sheriff's Department is still looking for the person responsible for Colleen's murder. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Mohave County Sheriff's Office at 928-753-0753, quoting case number DR number 710383.
Colleen Audrey Rice was recently identified as the homicide victim found in a canvas sack in the desert in Mohave County, Arizona. Her case was reopened in 2021, and in 2022, genealogists were brought on board to determine her family tree. They were able to locate a living distant relative with the records they found and confirmed her identity. They also found that she's from Portsmouth, Ohio, and was estranged from her family. Records also show that she was married to a man named William Davis, who's from Ohio as well, in 1946. But no other information past that year has surfaced yet. But her story doesn't end there. In addition to being from Portsmouth, Ohio, investigator Miller says Rice also has connections to eastern Kentucky, and one of the challenges they're facing right now is finding people who were around when this incident happened.
Yes, this became quite daunting in the fact that trying to locate people who might still be alive.
I was able to find a distant relative of Rice. His name is Eli Allen, and he's from Scioto County, Ohio. Allen says when learning about the case and hearing the name, he soon found they were related.
When I saw Rice, which is in my mother's line, I have to know how we're related because it was that much more intimate.
Allen is also a genealogist himself, and he says identifying one of his distant relatives who didn't have a name for more than 50 years is a testimony to the importance of the work he and so many others are doing.
To look back into and say, this is how this person ties to this person. So without work of genealogist, that work would be much more difficult.
Number 2. Bucks County John Doe. In June 1986, a fisherman making his way down the Delaware River made a horrific discovery. Close to the Morrisville boat ramp on the Pennsylvania side of the river, the fisherman discovered a human skull right on the riverbank. According to Othram, as the fisherman lived in Buckingham Township, Pennsylvania, he turned the skull over to the Buckingham Township Police, and they handled the subsequent investigation. A sweep of the scene was conducted, but no other bones could be found. The coroner confirmed that the skull was human and likely belonged to an adult male. As the remains discovered were only partial, investigators had a hard time creating a profile. They could not cross-reference missing persons cases in the area, as the skull had no identifiable characteristics. In 1986, DNA testing was still in its infancy, and with few leads, the Buckingham Township Police called in the Bucks County John Doe. The coroner had also been unable to determine the cause of death, only adding to the mystery. Investigators had a few ideas about who the skull belonged to, but the case went nowhere without concrete evidence. For decades, the case remained cold until 2019, when the Bucks County Coroner's Office took possession of the remains. Once in possession of the skull, the Coroner's Office entered it into NamUs, hoping that this would aid in identification in the future. In September 2022, the chain of custody would change again when the Bucks County detectives obtained the remains from the Coroner's Office. This group of detectives then reached out to Othram Labs, one of the most prominent players when it comes to DNA sequencing and genealogical analysis. According to Othram, CBC News, Othram obtained a DNA sample from the skull and began searching through public genealogy databases for a match. And they got one. A 49-year-old woman whose name has been withheld per her request was found to be a match to the skull found in 1986. The woman from Florida told investigators that her father had disappeared in 1985 in Trenton, New Jersey. Another DNA sample was obtained from the woman, which confirmed the parent-child relationship between herself and the remains. In January 2023, Othram, alongside the Bucks County District Attorney's Office, announced that the Bucks County John Doe had been identified as 31-year-old Richard Thomas Alt. Richard was last seen by his parents on December 24th, in 1984 in Trenton, New Jersey. His disappearance was not reported until early 1985. In April 1985, the body of Richard's girlfriend, Lori Sudnam, was discovered in the Delaware River close to Trenton. Following this discovery and the reports of Richard's disappearance, investigators began treating both of their cases as suspected homicides. Unfortunately, investigators had no idea that Richard's skull had been discovered in early 1986. Minimal evidence and few leads led to the case being closed. Neither investigators nor Richard's family had any idea that his body had been found just 8.5 miles away from the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. Bucks County District Attorney Matt Weintraub told CBS News, quote, "I hope that this powerful combination of technology and genealogy becomes a template for solving cold case and current cases now and in the future. I can't imagine having lost a family member for even a day, let alone 37 years. That wait is now over for Mr. Alt's family. I'm just glad that we could give them some peace of mind with this identification and the eventual return of his remains to his family." The Bucks County District Attorney's Office has reopened the investigation into Richard's death. Anyone with information is being asked to contact the District Attorney's Office at 215-348-6344. Number 1. Newport Jane Doe. On November 17, 2012, a group of excited amateur treasure hunters gathered at an abandoned coal mining site on Alden Mountain in Newport Township, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The group had chosen the area as it had once been the home of a thriving coal industry with mines dotted across the landscape. As the world began to move away from coal and fossil fuels, the mine shut down, leaving artifacts behind to be discovered by generations to come. This group readied their shovels and metal detectors, but their excitement was short-lived. Shortly after the digging commenced, some group members dropped their shovels in horror. They had come across something solid that let out a loud dink. When they shoveled the dirt away, they recoiled in horror as they discovered a long white bone staring back at them. Everyone in the group put down their shovels, took 10 steps back, and contacted the Pennsylvania State Troopers. The lively scene had now fallen into a somber mood. The Pennsylvania State Police cordoned off the scene and got to work recovering the remains, which were then transported to the local coroner's office. A few days after the discovery of the remains, the coroner's report was released, in which they noted that the remains likely belonged to a female in her late teens to early 20s. Her race was listed as unknown, but possibly an admixture of Caucasian, Hispanic, or Native American. The final parts of the coroner's report was probably the most chilling. It listed that the girl likely met foul play all the way back in the 1960s. How had her remains gone unnoticed and undiscovered for over 50 years? As the remains were determined to have possibly belonged to a teenager, NCMCE, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, became involved in the investigation. They created a composite sketch using her skull and circulated these images via news stations and social media. Whilst this did generate a few leads, none of them panned out, but the investigation was back to square one. A sample of her DNA was also submitted to police databases across the U.S., but again this generated no leads. Missing person cases were cross-referenced, but their leads fell apart each time investigators got close. In 2022, Pennsylvania State Troopers contacted Othram Labs and asked for their assistance. The Newport Jane Doe's DNA had previously been run, but only through police and governmental databases. This time, Othram was able to utilize public databases. Months after the DNA had been sequenced and cross-referenced against millions of samples, Othram contacted the Pennsylvania State Troopers, telling them they had found a possible family member. This potential family member was contacted and asked to provide another DNA sample to develop a complete profile. Genealogists at Othram also worked with them to create a complete family tree. In October of 2022, Othram and Pennsylvania State Troopers announced to the world that the remains found in 2012 belonged to 14-year-old Joan Joni Marie Diamond. Joni disappeared from her home in Andover Street in Wilkes-Barre on June 25, 1969, after telling her family she was going to play outside. The family had just eaten supper, and Joni was never seen or heard from again. The Pennsylvania State Troopers are investigating what happened to Joni. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Trooper Edward J. Urban of the Pennsylvania State Troopers at 570-542-4177, quoting case number P04-0744558.
Finally, some answers in a cold case that dates back more than 50 years.
How the teenage victim was identified decades after she went missing. It's our top story on Newswatch 16 at 6. Good evening, I'm Lisa Washington.
And I'm Scott Shea. For more than 50 years after that teenager went missing, her remains have been identified. The task now, find out who killed her. State police held a news conference in Wilkes-Barre, sharing new details on the case and what the next steps are.
Newswatch 16's Renee Workman explains the new information state police revealed today at the news conference.
More than 50 years after she disappeared in Luzerne County, the case of Joan Marie Diamond is one step closer to being solved. The 14-year-old was last seen on June 25, 1969.
After supper, she told her family she was going to go to the Andover Street Park in Wilkes-Barre, and she never returned. It was the last time Joan was ever seen by her family.
During a news conference at the State Police Barracks near Wilkes-Barre, Joan's older sister Suzanne told us that before Joan disappeared, she was ecstatic at the thought of becoming an aunt.
I was pregnant. I was due in August, and we spoke, and she was excited about being an aunt and me having a baby and coming down to visit and maybe help me out. And then she just disappeared.
Remains found in November 2012 at a former coal mining operation near Nanticoke have now been identified as belonging to Joan. State police provided photos of the location. Donations made to the Luzerne Foundation helped pay for the genetic genealogy tests that identified Joan's remains.
I know a lot of people believe that cases are forgotten. This is truly evidence that the cases are not forgotten.
It's a shame somebody so young and with her whole life ahead of her was taken. She was a sweet girl who didn't deserve what happened to her.
Investigators would not say how Joan died, but they call her death a homicide. State police hope former classmates from the class of 1973 at Myers High School may be able to help catch her killer.
We're talking people who went to school with her, maybe played sports with her, went to church with her. If you knew her at all, we're looking to speak with you.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing the chilling case of Martha Moxley. The suspected killer had been convicted of her murder, but his recent release has now called into question what happened. Let's get into it. The death of a young person is never easy. We say things like their life was cut short and they had so much more to offer the world. For Martha Moxley, those things were indeed true and more. Martha never got the opportunity to grow up and change the world. Her legacy was ripped from her, taken by force by a selfish individual who felt entitled to her. Nearly 5 decades after her life ended, Martha's name has become synonymous with violence, and her killer walks free, leaving her family to advocate for her justice. In the summer of 1974, Martha Moxley and her family moved to Greenwich, Connecticut. Their new home was in Bellhaven, an affluent, gated community in the heart of the state. The Moxley family had moved from California, where Martha and her brother John had been born and raised. Their father, John David, was a partner in a corporate accounting firm, and their mother, Dorothy, was a homemaker. Both were loving parents, and the family lived a seemingly charmed life. At school, both Martha and John excelled. Martha in particular was very popular. She made friends quickly and had an outgoing and vivacious personality. In the fall of 1975, Martha was a Western Junior High School sophomore. Martha got good grades in school. She was athletic, talented in various arts, with an affinity towards drawing and sketching, and had even been voted the most popular girl in school in her yearbook. Those who knew her said Martha was kind, confident, and easy to get along with. She was upbeat and friendly and was often surrounded by friends. Martha was also family-oriented. She didn't mind spending hours and hours with her family on trips or at home. However, like most teens, she wasn't perfect. Sometimes she would miss curfew, sneak a beer, or get caught smoking cigarettes. However, by and large, her parents noted she was a good kid and didn't have any concerns about her. They trusted her ability to make good decisions and felt she was responsible and level-headed. That summer, she made a new group of friends that she'd met at the Bellhaven Club within the gated community. With her new friends, they hung out at the pool and played tennis. According to her diary, it was there that she met a boy she was dating, but the relationship was very innocent. In the fall, Martha had just gotten her braces off, and she'd also tried out for the cheerleading team at her school. Her diary revealed her excitement for both of those events. Bellhaven was a very secure, exclusive, gated community. Anyone in and out was checked by security. Crime rarely occurred there, and it was assumed to be highly safe. All the neighbors knew each other, and all the kids seemed to get along. It was the kind of neighborhood where parents trusted other parents and felt that they had each other's backs. If kids were hanging out in the community, it was regarded as completely safe. No one could predict what would happen the last weekend of October. The likelihood that it was one of their own would tear the community apart. The night before Halloween, October 30th, was known as Mischief Night to the teens of Bellhaven. That evening, Martha was supposed to be grounded, but begged her mother to let her go out with her friends, and Dorothy Moxley agreed and let her go. Mischief Night was supposed to consist of innocent pranks, phone calls, bell ringing, maybe even toilet paper and a couple of trees. Nothing serious, and nothing that would cause damage to others. Martha left that evening around 6 p.m. She was accompanied by a somewhat large group of kids from the neighborhood. She left the house with her friend Helen and was due to come home at her 10 p.m. curfew. Dorothy stayed up waiting for Martha to come home, and once Martha's curfew had passed, she called over to Helen's house to check in and ask if Martha was still with her. Helen said Martha wasn't there. Helen had left the group around 9:30, and when she left, Martha was still at the neighbor's house, last seen with the Skagel boys, 17-year-old Tom Skagel and his younger brother, 15-year-old Michael Skagel. After the call with Helen, Dorothy was sure she would see Martha crossing the street to come home. As the hours passed, she eventually fell asleep sitting beside the window, waiting. The following morning, Dorothy checked Martha's bedroom and noticed the bed had yet to be slept in. She raced around the house, and when she couldn't locate Martha, she called the police. She knew right then that something was deeply wrong. The police, however, weren't initially concerned. They reassured Dorothy that missing teens usually turn up at a friend's house, but Dorothy knew Martha and something wasn't right. She and her son John decided to go door to door to ask neighbors if they knew where she was. The first place she went was over to the Skagel house. The father, Rushton Skagel, was a widower with 7 children. Rushton was the brother of Ethel Kennedy, wife of John F. Kennedy. Tom Skagel answered the door and told Dorothy he had not seen Martha since the night before, and neither had his brother. Dorothy continued knocking on doors and calling friends, to no avail. Soon the entire neighborhood would be out looking and calling out for Martha Moxley. A classmate of Martha's made the horrific discovery while cutting through the Moxley property. Underneath a spruce tree was the body of 15-year-old Martha Moxley. Martha lay face down in a pool of her own blood. Her head had been bludgeoned with a golf club, and she'd been stabbed in the neck. The golf club was mostly recovered, having been shattered into 4 pieces. However, the handle was missing. It was revealed that Martha's jeans, underwear, had been pulled down to her knees, but officials have stated that she wasn't sexually assaulted. Detectives speculated that Martha had been attacked only 200 feet from her front door. The first blow appeared to have been to her jaw, signifying she had faced her attacker, but evidence showed she'd been taken by surprise. She didn't have many defensive injuries, and the initial blow to her face had likely rendered her unconscious. There were drag marks from the initial attack site to under the tree where her body was found. The golf club was then likely broken into pieces, and a sharp portion of the shaft was used to stab Martha to death. No one heard or recalled hearing any screaming, but several neighbors reported their dogs barking from 9:45 till about 9:15 p.m. Trees on the property shielded Martha's attack from the view of Dorothy and other neighbors who could have witnessed it. There had only been one street lamp nearby, and it likely would have been quite dark. The discovery of Martha's body sent shock waves through the community. Police were called to the scene, and they uncovered a bizarre clue during their initial investigation. The golf club used to bludgeon Martha belonged to the Skagel family, matching a set found there. The media went into a frenzy once the Skakels became involved in the investigation. Though the Skakels didn't share the name, the Kennedy connection drew wild media attention. In addition to the family being wealthy, well-connected, all in their own right, Rushton was the heir to a coal empire. Detectives put together a timeline of Martha's last few hours. Based on reports from friends, Martha arrived at the Skakel home with her friends Helen and Jeffrey at 8:45 p.m. Michael Skakel was the one who opened the door, and the four hung out for a while before Tommy arrived. Then the five hung out until 9:30 p.m. when two other Skakel boys invited the group to a cousin's home nearby. That is when the group starts to disband. Michael asks Martha to go over with them, but she declines. Jeffrey walked Helen home, and Martha stayed at the Skakel house with Tommy. Investigators determined Martha had been attacked between 9:45 and 10 p.m., and both brothers had solid alibis. Tommy, who was the last person seen with Martha, told police he said goodbye to her around 9:30 p.m., and then he went inside to complete a school assignment, and then watched a television program with their live-in tutor. Similarly, Michael told investigators he was away from home between 9:15 p.m. and 11 p.m. at his cousin's house, and his story was corroborated by his cousins. In Martha's diaries, she revealed that both Skakel boys had been flirtatious with her at some point. She'd been practicing driving, and while in the car, Tommy had put his hand on her knee twice, which she had pushed away both times. She also said that Michael had been drunk and, quote, made an ass of himself. In her diaries, she doesn't appear to have reciprocated any romantic feelings for either boys. Still, that evening on October 30th, Helen remembers Martha and Tommy being playful and flirty with each other. Other friends revealed seeing Tommy and Martha go off behind a fence, and the two were later seen kissing around 9:30 p.m. Tommy became a prime suspect and was interviewed by detectives. Initially, detectives had been allowed to do a cursory search of the Skakel property. However, when it became clear that Tommy was being investigated as a suspect, Rushton stepped in with a small army of lawyers and stopped cooperating with law enforcement. After that, a warrant was never obtained, and law enforcement never went back to the home. Rushton Skakel eventually hired private investigators to conduct their own investigation. Allegedly, this was to assess any potential risks to either of his sons. As both boys had alibis, Greenwich investigators were forced to look elsewhere to 23-year-old Kenneth Littleton, the Skakel family's live-in tutor. Those in the Skakel household claimed Kenneth was outside at 9:45 p.m. to investigate a noise and returned around 10:25 p.m. Investigators dug deeper into Kenneth but found no reason for him to want to harm Martha, as the two had never met. Littleton had worked at the Skakel residence for less than a month before the murder. However, he stated he'd seen disturbing behavior from the kids he was supposed to be a companion to. He said he learned quickly that Michael was already developing issues with alcohol. He said once he discovered a chipmunk that had been killed with a golf club and pinned to the lawn with golf tees pierced through its body. He said he approached Michael about the chipmunk and asked if he'd done it. According to Kenneth, Michael responded, quote, "Who else could have done it, Kenny?" Though it needs to be said that Kenneth Littleton isn't the most reliable witness. A year after Martha's murder, he was fired from his job and harbored a deep resentment towards Rushton Skakel. He'd been fired because the eldest Skakel's kids' grades had gone down, and he had a series of substance abuse issues. He was hospitalized after attempting suicide, and it would take him over a decade to get his life back together. Without any solid evidence, the case went cold until 1991, when the case was reignited. In 1995, investigators discovered leaked documents from the private investigators that Rushton Skakel had hired. Documents revealed that Tommy and Michael had lied to Greenwich investigators during their initial interviews. Michael revealed to his father's private investigators that he'd not gone straight home at 11 p.m., and instead he went over to Martha's house, climbed a tree, and masturbated outside what he believed was Martha's bedroom window. According to Michael, he used to go around the neighborhood peeping into windows to, quote, jerk off. He said this was the first time he'd gone to Martha's house, and he hadn't initially realized the room he was at wasn't Martha's, it was her brother's. In the documents, it was also discovered Tom had last seen Martha closer to 10 p.m., not 9:30 p.m., throwing out half an hour of his alibi. Tom initially denied kissing Martha, but eventually stated that he'd kissed her, and the two had made out for a while before she went home. Both now had provided reasons as to why their DNA may have been found either on Martha's body or near the crime scene. Also, Michael's main alibi had been Helen, who had stated she saw Michael get in a car and drive away from the Skakel home. Helen was discovered to be a close family friend, and no one else could corroborate an alibi for Michael between 9:30 and 11:30 p.m. A new witness also came forward, claiming Michael had confessed to Martha's murder during his time at the Elan school, saying, quote, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." The school was a private institution that was part rehab, part psychiatric treatment facility. Michael was sent there after he caused a severe car accident while driving drunk. However, these claims were never substantiated, and the witness that had come forward died of a drug overdose before his statement could officially be taken under oath. In 1998, a grand jury ruled that there was enough evidence to arrest Michael Skakel for the murder of Martha Moxley. The theory was that Michael had a crush on Martha and that he went into a jealous rage when he saw Martha and his brother Tommy kissing. He then lied in wait for Martha to go home, attacking her with a golf club from his house and killing her. In 2002, audio recordings made by Michael Skakel were leaked to the prosecution. The recordings were for an autobiography Michael wanted to be written, and the audio recordings were used to shop around to different publishers. The unpublished book was sent to be called, quote, "Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean." In the recordings, he detailed what he remembered from October 30th, 1975. The recountings closely resembled what he'd said to his father's investigators, but also revealed that he'd been drunk and had been smoking pot, and he said that he'd been sexually attracted to Martha and, quote, "I wanted to kiss her, I wanted her to be my girlfriend, and I was going slow, being careful. The truth is that with Martha, I felt a little shy. I thought that maybe if we spent the evening together at my cousin's, something romantic might develop between us." After that, he went back to claiming that he'd gone to his cousin's house. However, the recording further cemented the theory that Martha's rejection and seeing Martha kissing Tommy may have been the trigger that set him off. On January 9th, 2000, Michael Skakel was arrested and charged with the murder of Martha Moxley. He was released later that day on a $500,000 bail. Initially, he was arraigned as a juvenile due to his age at the time of the crime, but a judge later ruled that due to the severity of the murder, he should be tried as an adult, and his trial began on May 7th, 2002. 4 weeks later, on June 7th, 2002, Michael Skakel was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Several appeals were lodged, many of which were unsuccessful. While incarcerated, Robert F. Kennedy wrote 2 books supporting his cousin's innocence, also subsequently going on a media tour to promote his books, but also to promote the belief that Michael was scapegoated into taking the fall for Martha's murder.
I never heard about this murder until 1983, which was 8 years after it was committed. I never knew Michael Skakel. I didn't know any of my Skakel cousins. I met Michael Skakel for the first time in 1983, which was 8 years after the murder. My family had almost no interactions with the Skakel family. One of the the foundational myths of this whole orthodoxy that has been created around this murder is that Michael Skakel is a Kennedy cousin.
If you were, back in your prosecutor days, right, and just sort of strip away the names and the relationships, if this file came across your desk with the evidence that was used against Michael Skakel, right, as a former prosecutor, what would you have done with that file?
You couldn't prosecute this case. There was no... Michael Skakel had an airtight alibi. He was 11 miles away with 5 eyewitnesses when the murder was committed. So he had never been a suspect. He was a tiny little kid at that time. Michael Skakel's name never came up on the list of possible suspects.
In 2013, a judge granted Michael a new trial, and he was released on bond. Still then, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated the original conviction, and he was remanded back into custody. However, in 2018, the Connecticut Supreme Court reversed the ruling overturning the conviction. In 1975, the original investigators from Greenwich PD were noted as inexperienced in investigating this type of crime. It's unclear how much of the evidence had been preserved correctly. At the time, Greenwich wasn't known for many murders, and so when dealing with a case of this magnitude, having inexperienced law enforcement working the case could have been detrimental.
Best chance of my getting this parole is to admit guilt to this crime. But again, 10 and a half years later, I can't do that. I did not commit this crime.
As far as re-examining evidence, it is unclear if the clothing worn by Martha was ever re-examined for DNA, or if it might be worth exhuming her body to see if any new forensic evidence can be found. Keeping in mind her body had been dragged 80 to 90 feet, and there should be DNA left behind from the killer. Accusations of special treatment for the Skakel family also plagued the original investigation. Once the murder weapon had been identified as coming from the Skakel home, proper search of the property was never conducted. This seems to have been a huge lack of judgment from law enforcement. A key piece of evidence was also never found. It was the golf club handle. That piece likely holds key evidence that could directly point to the killer by way of fingerprint or DNA. There also appears to be several pieces of evidence missing from the original case file. Photographs from the autopsy were cataloged but have since disappeared, along with other pieces taken by the medical examiner. This case gets more and more mysterious. Missing evidence, bumbled police investigations, and accusations of special treatments, all in what appears to be an effort to protect a killer. Which begs the question, who is worth protecting? Or rather, whose reputation is worth protecting? And how much money does it cost? And whose pockets are deep enough to afford it?
And with me now is Dorothy Moxley, Martha Moxley's mother. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily.
What's your reaction to Michael Skakel when he said that to you outside of court last week?
Well, I was very surprised that he would come up to me, and I remember thinking I have not any idea what to say, and so I think the best thing is not to say anything. My first thought was that this was planned. I don't know why, but then afterwards I thought, well, this is a typical Skakel kind of thing to do. His father would have done that type of thing. I mean, they just feel as though they're, they're within their bounds all the time, and it doesn't make any difference what they do.
And it certainly got a fair amount of press afterwards.
Yes.
Do you, in your heart, believe that they've charged the right person with this crime?
I do. I really do.
And what has led you to that conclusion?
Well, the murder weapon came from the Skakel house, and that was the last place she was seen alive. After a few months, they stopped cooperating. And why would you stop cooperating if you didn't have something to hide? And then in recent, in the last few years, since about 1994, we have been able to talk to people who have gone to rehab centers with Michael. And we found out more about his personality. And we've heard from, now I have not personally heard what these people have to say.
They allegedly told the grand jury that he confessed while he was at this Elon school in Maine.
I understand it's something like that. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what.
Now, will that be allowed, though? Do you understand that testimony will be allowed in court?
Yes. A testimony from the director of Elon, Mr. Ritchie, and from any of the hired professional people will not be allowed. But anything that was said to a friend or a bunkmate or someone in the cafeteria line with them, that type of thing can be used, yes.
Michael Skakel was released from prison and is now a free man. According to reports, the state of Connecticut does not plan to retry Michael Skakel for the murder of Martha Moxley due to insufficient forensic evidence. Many of the original witnesses have now passed away. Many believe that had Michael Skakel not come from such a prominent family, the case never would have been dismissed, overturned, or ignored. Martha Moxley's killer likely still walks free, and her case remains unsolved, and justice for her murder has never been served. Martha would be 63 years old this year, but will remain 15 forever in the hearts of those who still remember her. Her father, who passed in 1988, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Dorothy, now in her early 90s, continues to keep Martha's murder case in the spotlight with the help of her son, John. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more unidentified murder victim cold cases. With these cases, you never know who might see these stories and who might hold a key piece of evidence needed to solve them. Let's get into it. Number 4. Carbon Jane Doe. For a first case, there isn't a lot of information publicly available, but this is what we know so far. It was on April 21, 1995, when human remains were discovered in a ditch in Carbon, Alberta, Canada. The remains were significantly decomposed, with estimations that she'd been deceased for 10 to 15 years, putting her time of death to be sometime in the early to mid-1980s. Carbon is a very small community in rural Alberta, with the closest city being Drumheller. The community is primarily farming and ranching, with a population of less than 500 people, which may explain why her body was never found for so long. A forensic expert examined the remains and concluded that Carbon Jane Doe was 20 to 35 years of age at the time of her death. She was between 5 foot and 5'4". She had multiple stainless steel crowns as well as fillings, so she had undergone extensive dental work throughout her life. They believe she was mixed race with North African or Indigenous ancestry, though they believe she wasn't from Canada because she had contracted brucellosis at some point in her life, which would have caused her to have a debilitating disease impacting her life. Brucellosis would have compromised her immune system, giving her joint pain, fatigue, and frequent fevers. Brucellosis isn't an infectious disease found commonly in Canada, and it comes from consuming animal products from infected cattle, goats, and pigs. However, some have pointed out that Carbon Jane Doe could have been in a residential school at some point in her life, as it was common for children to get sick from brucellosis there from unpasteurized milk given to children from sick animals. Carbon Jane Doe doesn't match any missing persons cases in Canada, but if she had been put into a residential school, her family may not know or have been able to report her missing. Also, based on her bone structure, they believe she may have given birth at least once in her life. A cause of death could not be determined due to the integrity of the remains. She was found without clothing or any personal items. Maybe she had none to begin with, or simply had disappeared throughout time. It's too hard to tell. In 2019, a clay reconstruction was done to show what she may have looked like. Carbon Jane Doe is one of 421 ongoing missing persons cases in the province of Alberta, and they hope that even after nearly 4 decades, someone might recognize her. Number 3. Little Miss Lake Panisofsky. It was on February 17, 1971, when 2 partygoers made their way down Interstate 75 close to the Lake Panisofsky Bridge in Sumter County, Florida. There they made a grisly discovery. Their Mardi Gras plans were halted as they realized they were looking at the body of a young woman in the waters below. The 2 were able to flag down a passing state trooper, and what would unfold would become one of the most bizarre Jane Doe cases in Florida. The Sumter County Sheriff's Office quickly arrived at the scene and began their investigation. A man's size 36 belt was still wrapped around her neck, and it was clear her assailant had thrown her into the waters below from the bridge. Her remains were heavily decomposed and in a state of putrefaction. The coroner would later determine that she'd been deceased anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days at the time of her discovery. The woman was transported to the local coroner's office for an autopsy. In their initial findings, the coroner ruled that the woman was between the ages of 17 to 24, possibly of European descent, with long brown hair and possibly brown eyes. At some point in her life, likely between 1967 and 1970, the woman had undergone the Watson-Jones orthopedic technique on her right ankle. This surgery entails 2 holes being drilled into the ankle with tendons being fed through them to combat instability. Harris lines were also found on the young woman's bones, a key indicator of malnutrition or illness in childhood which affected growth. Fractures to her ribs 1 and 3 were also found and determined to have occurred perimortem, or closely occurring at the time of her death. One thing stood out to investigators was her teeth. The woman had undergone extensive dental work in her short life. She had porcelain crowns and silver fillings, which were costly procedures. Copies of her records were sent to dentists throughout Florida, but nobody recognized her. She was found wearing a poncho with a green and white print, green plaid pants, a green t-shirt, and a white gold Baylor watch, a yellow gold ring with a clear stone, and a thin gold necklace. The ring was worn on her left ring finger, indicating she may have been engaged or married. The coroner had also determined that she'd given birth at least once in her life, although it's possible it may have been twice. All attempts to uncover the woman's identity have failed, and this is when the Sumter County Sheriff's Office began calling her Little Miss Lake Panisofsky, after the lake she was found in. She was eventually laid to rest in the Oak Grove Cemetery in Wildwood, Florida. In 2012, the Sumter County Sheriff's Office exhumed Little Miss P again, following a 1986 exhumation. DNA samples were obtained and sent to George Kamenov of the University of Florida's Geology Department. Kamenov performed isotope testing on Little Miss P's teeth. He discovered a high concentration of lead in the teeth and was able to pinpoint her origins to be near Athens, Laveron, or Lorum in Greece. Kamenov was also able to determine that Little Miss P had only been in the U.S. for 10 to 12 months before her murder. On November 30th, 2012, a bizarre new lead would emerge. A Greek TV station discussed the case of Little Miss Panisofsky. The TV station opened up its phone lines, and in one of these calls, a distraught woman claimed to know the identity of Little Miss P. The caller told the host that the girl in the sketches resembled a girl she knew named Konstantina, who attended the Dean School within Kefisia, Greece between 1969 and 1970. Young girls were sent to these schools to learn to cook, clean, look after children, and speak English. These schools hoped then to send the girls to the U.S. and Australia to work as nannies or to attend university. She went on to say that in 1970, when the two graduated, she was sent to Australia whilst Konstantina was sent to the U.S. Konstantina and other 1970 graduates were the first to travel to their prospective countries by airplane, so it was possible that records exist. Weeks later, the segment re-aired, this time with a photograph from the caller which highlighted Konstantina. Many have drawn parallels to the sketches and approximations of Little Miss P and Konstantina, although the caller added that Konstantina's brows were thicker and her cheeks chubbier. Since this episode is aired, there's been little movement on the case, and investigators continue to try and uncover the identity of Little Miss P and her killer. If you have any information, you're asked to contact Detective Darren Norris of the Sumter County Sheriff's Office at 325-569-1600, quoting case number 71-0291. Number 2. Compton Jane Doe. On September 13, 1975, residents of Compton, California were met with a disturbing discovery. Just off the 700 block of West Artesia Boulevard and Wilmington Avenue, the body of a nude black teenager had been found dumped at the side of the road. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were called to the scene and immediately determined that she'd been shot twice in the head. Her body would also tell another shocking story. Investigators determined that she'd likely been thrown from a moving vehicle, which proved to be the fatal injury, not the 2 shots to the head. The area in which she was found was an industrial area, and there were few witnesses. The Los Angeles County coroner, who performed the autopsy, commented that the girl was black, between the ages of 14 and 17, 4'11" and 5'2", and 90 to 110 pounds. She'd been deceased just hours prior to her discovery, giving them a strong hope of identifying her quickly. Jane Doe is described as having short curly black hair, brown eyes, and 1 to a 1.5 inch scar on the instep of her left foot. She was found nude but was wearing the following jewelry: a gold ring with a large black stone that contained a smaller gold flower, a silver or white gold ring with 1 white stone and 6 green stones, a gold bracelet, a white gold or silver bracelet, and a white gold or silver keychain necklace. Despite her being found nude, there was no signs of sexual assault, and according to the Doe Network, all toxicology screenings came back negative for alcohol and other substances. Several months passed, and despite a few appeals, nobody came forward to claim her. Unfortunately, Jane Doe, or Jane Doe 51, has received little to no media attention, unlike other Jane Does in California and beyond. Shortly after her discovery, she was cremated, and DNA, dental, and fingerprint samples were taken for reference. The NCMEC and NamUs have created approximation sketches of what she may have looked like in life. Anyone with information is asked to contact Sergeant Frederick Reynolds of the LA County Sheriff's Department at 323-533-1004, quoting case number 18735, or Betsy Magdaleno of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office at 323-343-0512, quoting case number 1975-11050. Number 1. Perry County Jane Doe. On June 20th, 1979, a stonemason working on Route 332 near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, made a startling discovery. Over an embankment close to the Juanita River lay the remains of a young woman. The Perry County Sheriff's Department was called to the scene, and the investigation commenced. Unfortunately, there's little information surrounding the circumstances in which she was found. The Perry County coroner performed the autopsy and noted that the remains were badly decomposed and primarily skeletal. Due to the state of the remains, the coroner was unable to discern a cause of death. However, it was recorded as a likely homicide. At the time of the discovery, she'd been deceased for months, possibly even a year, before she was discovered, with the tentative death date of late 1978 being set. In the report, the coroner noted the remains belonging to a white woman aged 50 to 38 with light blonde or light brown hair who was 5'2" to 5'9". The woman has come to be known as the Perry County Jane Doe, and she'd suffered a fracture to her 9th rib in her life, and by the time of her death the wound had healed. The Doe Network notes her extensive dental history, reporting no signs of disease or trauma. Dental records indicated her first right molar was removed 3 to 4 years before she was murdered, and was hypothesized that her right second molar had also been extracted. Her dental records were circulated to dentists across the state, but nobody recognized them. The most striking piece of evidence lay not with her bones, but with what adorned them. She was found wearing blue wool knit pants with red thread, a white lace blouse, a dark blue tank top, a tan-colored jacket, a white bra, red and gray socks, and white leather buckled shoes. She also wore a silver Avon bracelet, a sterling silver Native American turquoise oblong ring with matching earrings, necklace, and another sterling silver ring with black onyx stone. Investigators quickly discovered the jewelry may have originated from the Navajo and Zuni peoples in New Mexico and Arizona. This discovery led investigators to these states and wondered whether she may have been a victim of a southwestern serial killer. Composite sketches of the Perry County Jane Doe were placed around town, but sadly no one recognized her. It pained investigators to think that nobody was out looking for her. Months after she was discovered, she was laid to rest in an anonymous grave. Her case has received little coverage and attention over the years, but the Perry County Sheriff's Office and coroner have never forgotten about her. There have been several efforts to uncover the true identity of the Perry County Jane Doe, also known as the girl with the turquoise jewelry. Recently, new dental x-rays were conducted, which showed anomalies that contradicted the initial report. Initially, investigators believed that she'd only had 1 molar removed. However, this new x-ray suggests that at least 2 had been removed, although there's no sign of crowding or disease that would have prompted this. Overall, her dental hygiene was good, signaling she had access to care at some point in her life. In 2008, the girl with the turquoise jewelry was exhumed for further testing. DNA samples were obtained and run through CODIS, and there have been no matches so far. In 2008, Dr. Christine France of the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute analyzed 3 samples from Jane Doe: a hair fiber, a bone fragment, and a tooth. Dr. France was able to undertake isotope analysis by examining the hydrogen and oxygen molecules in these samples. Dr. France concluded that Jane Doe likely grew up in the Great Lakes region or southern Canada. Evidence also suggested that shortly before her death, she left the area and spent time in the southwest United States. These results lined up with the indigenous jewelry she had been found wearing. Her details and photographs have also been sent to Canadian authorities, but they too are just as baffled. In 2018, NCMEC released a new composite sketch that they have created using a CT scan of her skull. Redditors in the r/Grateful Doe subreddit have made several suggestions over the years as to her identity. The first is 17-year-old Cheryl Ann Moser. Cheryl disappeared from Senkane, Pennsylvania sometime in 1977. According to reports, Cheryl was last seen walking to meet a friend. Another suggestion is Connie Gail Minchika, a 17-year-old girl who disappeared from Napa, California on June 9, 1978. Both Cheryl and Connie were said to have been dating or involved with biker gangs at the time of their disappearances, and may believe that the two were met with foul play. Anyone with information about the girl with the turquoise jewelry is asked to contact Trooper Scott Danish at the Pennsylvania State Troopers at 717-671-7500, quoting case number H05-0149355. Alternatively, you can contact the FBI VICAP at 800-634-4097, quoting case number 2011-03-04, Jane Doe 23. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more cold cases of Jane Does recently identified and the mysteries surrounding their deaths. Let's get into it. Number 4. Amanda Lynn Schumann Deza. For 27 years, a woman known only as the Lady in the Fridge has laid unidentified. In March 1995, a bottle picker searching for bottles and cans came across a submerged refrigerator in the Whiskey Slough Canal near Bacon Island Road in Holt, California. Curious, he waded over to the fridge and opened it up to inspect its contents. The fridge door had been tied shut, and when he opened it, he made a disturbing discovery. Inside the fridge was the body of a young woman. Her hands had been bound with tape, and a sock had been stuffed inside her mouth. The authorities were immediately called, but none of the attending officers could have prepared themselves for what they were about to see. The medical examiner determined that the woman had been submerged for around 6 months. However, the internal temperature of the fridge had been quite warm, which had led to accelerated decomposition. They estimated the time of her death to be somewhere in October of 1994. In the report, the medical examiner noted that the woman was Caucasian with strawberry blonde hair, 110 to 130 pounds, between the ages of 29 and 41. Her cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, and investigators were keen to uncover her identity, but that would be easier said than done. Jane Doe became known as the Lady in the Fridge, and missing person reports from across the country and beyond were cross-referenced with her details, but no one matched. Investigators continued looking into her case, but it became colder and colder as the years went by. Each year, investigators would glance over the case files, hoping something new would stand out, but nothing ever did. Her details were entered into NamUs, but still no leads came up. Then in 2022, the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office contacted Othram, asking for their assistance. The skeletal remains of the Lady in the Fridge were handed over to Othram, who were able to extract a DNA profile. Using genealogical techniques and databases, Othram was able to find the possible mother of the Lady in the Fridge. All the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office had to do was obtain a DNA sample. Finally, in February 2023, Othram and the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office announced that the Lady in the Fridge had been identified as 30-year-old Amanda Schumann Deza. At the time of her disappearance, Amanda was separated from her husband and was a mother to 3 children. According to friends and family, she was last seen in Napa, California, at an unknown apartment complex with an unidentified male friend who she had met at a rehab facility. Investigators believe serial killer Terry Rasmussen may be involved in Amanda's disappearance and murder, although nothing has been confirmed yet. Her children, now adults, are thankful for law enforcement and hope that her murder investigation can now be solved. They said in a statement to the media that they look forward to moving on with their lives. Their mother's disappearance had always been an open wound and has brought them some comfort knowing that their mother never abandoned them. Amanda was known to frequent the Napa, Oakley, and Delta, California areas. There's a $10,000 reward for tips that lead to an arrest. Anyone with information about Amanda is asked to call the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit at 209-468-5087.
We look forward to prosecuting the fullest extent of law the coward that committed this heinous act and the individual who decided to take this lovely lady's wife and take her away from her family.
Amanda was a daughter, sister, and mother. Authorities believe she died of blunt force trauma to the head at least 6 months before she was found.
Number 3. Marina Ramos. On December 11, 1989, 2 tourists making their way down Old Temple Bar Road, Mojave County, Arizona, just 50 miles from Las Vegas, made a startling discovery. At the side of the road lay the body of a young woman who had been stabbed multiple times. Her clothes had been removed, and it was clear to onlookers that she'd been attacked where she fell. The Mojave County Sheriff's Office took over the case and began their investigation. The medical examiner determined her time of death to be around 24 hours, but there was no sign of her killer. In 1989, there was very little evidence to work with, and her case quickly ran cold. In late 2021 or early 2022, the case was reopened with fresh eyes and a new approach to crime scene investigation. Fingerprints from Jane Doe were obtained, which led them to the potential identity of a woman named Maria Ortiz from Bakersfield, California. When the family of Maria were visited, they could not recall anyone by that name, but they did remember that their cousin, Maria Ramos, had disappeared sometime in 1989. A DNA sample was obtained from a close relative, and sure enough, it was a match. Finally, the 1989 Jane Doe was identified as Marina Ramos, who had been 28 years old at the time of her disappearance. Investigators also learned that Marina's daughters, 14-month-old Elizabeth Lisa Ramos and 2-month-old Jasmine Maria Ramos, disappeared around the same time. Witnesses recalled seeing Marina in the company of a man known as Fernando, who was in his 30s or 40s and drove a black SUV. According to reports, Marina, Fernando, Elizabeth, and Jasmine were headed from Bakersfield, California to Ontario, California, before she mysteriously disappeared. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Mojave County Sheriff's Office at 928-753-0753. Number 2. Sandra Morton. It was on February 28, 1980, when 2 men, a father and son duo, were sifting for gold and making their way along Fly Creek in Clark County, Washington, when they came across human remains. The exact location of the body was close to NF 54, where it split with Canyon Creek. According to reports, the remains were almost intact aside from the torso and hands being missed. The remains were said to be mostly skeletal. In the report, the medical examiner concluded that the remains likely belonged to a young woman, aged 13 to 18, although most likely in the 15 to 16-year-old range. Her cause of death remained undetermined, and there was very little information the medical examiner could garner from her remains. She was believed to be Native American or Hispanic and had well-developed neck muscles, indicating she was likely involved in sports or manual labor. The case quickly went cold, and investigators were eventually assigned to other cases. In 2016, the NCMEC and Nikki Costa of the Clark County Medical Examiner's Office created a new 3D rendering of her face from her skull, giving us the first lifelike shot. This photo was widely circulated, but again generated no leads. Then in 2019, the Clark County Sheriff's Office made a shocking announcement. The Fly Creek Jane Doe had been identified as 16-year-old Sandra Sandy Morton. According to reports, Parabon Nanolabs aided in Sandy's identification, although the exact methods used have not been released. Also at that announcement, they stated that Sandy is likely not a victim of the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy, and anyone who had known Sandy around the time of her disappearance is asked to come forward. Sandy was born on April 29, 1962 in San Francisco, California, with the family moving to Washington State when she was still young. In 1971, Sandy's parents divorced and she went to live with her father, Andy Morton, who lived and worked in Vancouver, Washington. Andy's job often had him working out of town, so Sandy often lived with friends or relatives. According to Coin News, Sandy last attended Wilson High School in 1966 to 1967. She was due to enroll at the Newburgh High School in late 1977, but failed to attend her first class. Ever since then, her whereabouts had been unknown. Sandy's family had no idea that her remains had been found just miles from where she had lived. It has not been stated whether she was officially reported missing. Investigators ask anyone with information to contact the Clark County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit at 654-397-2036.
When Sandra Morton first disappeared from Clark County in the 1970s, her family never imagined her remains would be found near Fly Creek in Amboy, Washington, a few years later. The Clark County Sheriff's Office says Sandra was just 16 years old when she disappeared from her dad's home.
He came home and she was gone. And so, of course, he called my mom, and my grandmother at the time was still alive also. You know, he called us and the search started. Death never entered my mind. I never thought, oh, she's dead. You know, I mean, I just always believed that she was out there somewhere.
Number 1. Nora Elia Castillo. In June 1988, a farmer walking through his fields 20 miles outside Springfield, Colorado, discovered skeletal human remains. The Baca County Sheriff's Office were immediately alerted, and several more parts of the remains were discovered. Baca County Sheriff's Office searched the farmer's field for several days, finding several items of clothing, gray corduroy Levi pants, a size 34B bra, and a beige winter coat with faux fur collar and cuffs. A 1986 quarter was found in one of the pockets. The Baca County coroner was not able to determine the cause of death, only that the remains had been in the field for between 1 to 3 years. According to the Doe Network, most of the skeleton had been bleached by the sun and parts of the spine was still attached. The coroner estimated that the remains belonged to a woman aged 16 to 22, possibly Hispanic, Native American, or European. The coroner also noted that the woman had extensive dental work, including 2 silver cast crowns, the technique of which suggested that she was from Mexico or close to the border. Unfortunately, the case ran cold quickly. Dental records were sent to dentists in the area, but no matches were found. Dental records and a DNA profile were also submitted to the National Crime Information Center, which led nowhere. The woman was eventually buried in the Springfield Cemetery as a Jane Doe. The Baca County Sheriff's Office never forgot her case and vowed to get answers. In 2021, the Jane Doe was exhumed and a new DNA profile was obtained. According to the press release, this DNA sample was submitted to NamUs. The details were murky. However, according to KOAA, it appeared that the DNA sample was submitted to Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, public genealogy databases. From there, Michelle Kennedy, an investigative genetic genealogist, discovered a first cousin once removed. Genealogists were able to work through Jane Doe's family tree and came across possible close relatives. According to the Baca County Sheriff's Office, they were notified by NamUs that a possible DNA match had been found. As per their press release, quote, not only was the familial DNA submitted for analysis by Solved by DNA, a match with family of our Jane Doe, but the DNA profile of a person who submitted her DNA sample to the McAllen, Texas Police Department had also linked to our Jane Doe by NamUs. On October 6, 2022, the Baca County Sheriff's Office announced that in 1988, Jane Doe had been identified as Nora Elia Castillo. Nora's daughter submitted a DNA profile to the McAllen Police Department in 2004. Nora was reported missing in 1996, with reports stating the last time she made contact with her family was sometime in 1986 or 1987 via a phone call from Colorado. Investigators are still looking into Nora's case, and anyone with information is asked to contact the Baca County Sheriff's Office at 719-523-4511 or the McAllen, Texas Police Department at 956-681-2221. Hello, and welcome in or welcome back to the channel. This is True Crime Mysteries. My name's Megan, and today we're going to be discussing the disturbing cold case of 2 teens murdered in Texas, the man who confessed to their murders, and the connection to a serial killer in the area. Though this is currently a cold case, it has a very high chance of being resolved and soon, along with 11 other murder cases. Cases we cover, there is always hope that someone holds that key piece of evidence that could be what detectives need to get this solved. But with that being said, let's get into it. It was on November 14th, 1971, when best friends 15-year-old Maria Johnson and 15-year-old Debbie Ackerman set out for a surfing trip headed out for Galveston, Texas. Galveston is known for its beautiful beaches, year-round sunny weather, and some of the best surfing in the United States. The 2 teens were nearly inseparable. Debbie was outgoing, bubbly, and remembered as always laughing. Maria was more shy. Lots of people knew her to be quiet, but close friends knew her true and chatty nature. The 2 were just starting out in life and were full of hope and promise. Excellent students who both loved the outdoors, especially surfing. Debbie was a champion water skier. Born and raised in Galveston, she was a natural at water sports and took to it easily. Maria had recently moved to the island, and the 2 had met at Ball High School, and the 2 quickly became best friends. The families of Maria and Debbie were also well acquainted with each other. Given their daughter's strong bond, there was no issue with them being out or going out on day trips. But the rule was that they stick together, call home if plans changed, and to be home by curfew. That day, the girls planned to visit Houston, Texas, which is around 55 miles from Galveston or about an hour's drive. As the girls were both 15, they didn't have cars yet and planned to hitchhike. But it was the 1970s, and it was incredibly common for young men and women to hitchhike across the globe. Whilst the practice has been outdated as pretty dangerous now, in the 1970s many young people saw it as the perfect way to get around. Hitchhiking in a pair seemed less dangerous than trying to hitch a ride alone. It was around midday on that Sunday. They were near Stewart Beach, outside of a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. Witnesses reported seeing the 2 buy ice cream and then start asking around for rides. A man in a white van pulled up to the curb and asked the girls where they were going. The 2 replied that they needed to get to Houston, and coincidentally, Houston was on his route. The 2 giggled as they got into their ride, not knowing it would be the last time they would ever be seen alive. Debbie and Maria's parents began to worry when they didn't receive a call from their daughters. Before the time of cell phones, the parents had no way of knowing if the girls had made it safely to Houston. The next morning, the worried parents called the Houston Police Department to report their daughters missing. Thankfully, the report was taken seriously, and they were not dubbed as runaways as many teens were during this time. The Galveston Police and Houston Police collaborated to coordinate a statewide search for the 2 girls. 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, the search for the 2 girls ended in heartbreak. A fisherman found the body of Maria first in Turner's Bayou in Texas City, roughly 18 miles from Galveston. Law enforcement then found Debbie's body 100 yards away. Both girls had their hands bound, had their clothes from their waist down removed, sexually assaulted, and shot twice to the back of the skull. Their bodies were then dumped in the waters below. The crime rocked Galveston, the state of Texas, and the nation, who would be so callous towards such young girls who were only trying to get to Houston. Despite the enormous media outcry, there were few leads, and the case quickly went cold. The families of Debbie and Maria made multiple appeals for the guilty party to come forward, but those appeals fell on deaf ears. But the murder of these two young girls was not going to be the end for Texas law enforcement. Throughout the 1970s, there were going to be many more murders, all of similar circumstances to plague Texas. This would only be the beginning, and a week after Debbie and Maria's bodies were discovered, the body of 14-year-old Colette Anise Wilson was found near the Addicks Reservoir. Colette had been missing since June 17th and had been abducted from Alvin, Texas after band practice. She had also been shot execution-style to the back of the skull. After the discovery of Colette, another body was found nearby. This would be 19-year-old Glory Ann Gonzalez. She had disappeared from near her apartment on October 28th. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Then, in January 1972, two boys found the bodies of 13-year-old Sharon Lynn Shaw and Rhonda Renee Johnson in Clear Lake, Galveston. The remains had been skeletal by the time they were discovered. The girls had been missing since August 4th, 1971. They'd been abducted while at the beach in Harris County. In addition to these murders, there were 5 others, bringing the total to 11. All in a 12-month period, all with similar circumstances. Over the years, that number would grow to nearly 30 in the area, all unsolved cold cases. Debbie and Maria's case would be reopened in 1998 when convicted killer Edward Harold Bell sent letters to prosecutors in the area confessing to the murders of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in 1971, along with 9 others. The letter started off with, "Dear Sir, I have decided to tell you I was brainwashed into killing Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in November 1971, and went on to say, quote, if you could get me immunity from prosecution of any kind, I could lay a lot of stuff on you, and I will." However, when examined, the confessions were deemed as unreliable evidence and dismissed. Bell was interviewed, but he asked for immunity in exchange for testimony and refused to cooperate. Harris County prosecution has gone on to say that letters have now been lost, though detectives who had been able to see the letters stated that there had been information about the crimes that had never been revealed to the public, leaving some to believe they were credible. Edward Bell was already serving a 71-year prison sentence for the murder of Larry Dickens. It was on August 24, 1978, when Bell was in Pasadena, California, parked in a local neighborhood. He was in his vehicle, without pants on, watching a group of girls playing. A father and former Marine supervising the kids saw Bell, saw what was going on in the vehicle, and approached Bell, attempting to get the vehicle's keys so that Bell couldn't flee the scene. While confronting him, Bell drew a pistol and shot Larry. Larry was wounded and crawling back to his driveway when Bell got out of his vehicle, grabbed a shotgun from the back, and killed Larry Dickens before getting his keys and attempting to flee. He was caught soon after by law enforcement. Edward Bell had been released on a $125,000 bail, but when he was released, he fled the state, eluding law enforcement for 14 years. He fled the country for Mexico and then Central America. It was a tip that came in that he was in Panama after he was shown on the TV program America's Most Wanted. It was there he was arrested and extradited back to California. Edward Bell was born in southern Texas in 1939, primarily living in the Houston area. He'd went to university to become a teacher, but it doesn't appear that he ever was. He was first arrested in 1966 for exposing himself to minors. He escaped jail by asking the judge for leniency and opted for psychiatric treatment, which he received. After treatment, he was arrested again in 1969 for the same crime. Again, jail was avoided in favor of psychiatric treatment. His first wife divorced him and also cut ties with his 3 children, citing him as a danger to herself and their kids. While in treatment, it was discovered that he was romancing patients there, and he ended up marrying a 17-year-old he met while in treatment. He was 31 at that time. After his release, he moved to Galveston with his new wife and became involved in a local surfing business. It was an area that Maria Johnson and Debbie Ackerman had been known to frequent, along with several other of these cold case victims. In 1974, he was arrested again, this time for violently sexually assaulting a patient that he'd met at a mental hospital he'd previously been at. The charges were dropped in that case as well, and he was never formally charged. He was arrested several times throughout his time in Texas, but each time he would always elude being formally charged. He eventually left Texas and moved to California. That was when the Larry Dickens murder occurred. So, an extensive criminal history of inappropriate behavior towards minors, sexual assault, violence, and abduction. He would brag to his friends that he could talk himself out of anything. But for such an extensive criminal history, it's shocking that he was still allowed to walk free for as long as he did. And whilst Edward Bell somewhat claimed responsibilities for the murders, he would later recant his confessions, making this case all the more confusing. Bell told the Daily Mail that his father had brainwashed him as a child to be a flasher and to sexually assault and kill girls. In his original letter, he confessed to murdering Debbie and Maria, along with Sharon Shaw, Rhonda Renee Johnson, Colette Anise Wilson, Gloria Ann Gonzalez, Georgia Geer, Brooks Bracewell, Nina Lynn Kluge, and Kimberly Ray Pitchford, who had been a 16-year-old murdered in 1973 and hadn't been believed to be connected to the other murders. He also confessed to an unnamed victim that has yet to be identified. He referred to them in his letters as the 11 that went to heaven. Bell then went on to take several interviews with local newspapers in 2017, quote, "I did not kill Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson." He explained that he had confessed to the murders because he was suicidal at the time and wanted the state to sentence him to the death penalty. He also blamed his depression on a network of government spies that were conspiring against him. Throughout his various prison interviews, Bell mentions the supposed program that he was put through and the brainwashing he endured. In his letters, he confessed to callously taking the lives of Debbie, Maria, and countless other women, but he also notes that he was brainwashed to do so. One of the journalists who interviewed him believes that he suffers from some sort of severe psychiatric disorder. She described his behavior as erratic, paranoid, and full of grand conspiracies about the government. He never took full responsibility for the murders he committed. Instead, he said that he was forced to by the program. And despite concerns that he was making everything up, the details about the crimes themselves were clear and matched police reports that were never made public. In addition to the confessions and that he lived in the area of the abductions, he also owned a white van. We know about the van because he was arrested while driving it in January 1972 for exposing himself to minors. This van matched the description of the vans that Debbie and Maria had last been seen getting into. At this point in time, it's unclear because it hasn't been made public if there's DNA evidence to compare. And it's also unclear if Texas law enforcement is continuing to look into Edward Bell as a suspect. It doesn't mean they aren't, it just means it isn't publicly available. There's also no solid evidence that we know of tying him to any of the murders at this point in time. All of the current evidence is circumstantial, though records show even when he was in Panama, wherever Edward Bell lived, teenage girls were abducted and murdered. A string of cold cases seem to follow him in all of the places he has ever been known to reside in. Unfortunately, Edward Bell passed away in 2019 at the age of 80 before investigators could verify his accounts further. Maria's sister told local media that she had no words for Edward Harold Bell, but was happy that he, quote, no longer walks this earth and will never be paroled. The case of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson remains unsolved. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Galveston County District Attorney, Jack Rohde, at 1-800-566-2209. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more cases of wrongful convictions being overturned thanks to new evidence. Let's get into it. Number 4. Michael Morton. Michael and Christine Morton were a very average American family. By 1986, the couple had welcomed their first son, Eric, into the world. And in Michael's own words, quote, We were average, a chunk of demographic study, the house, the yard, the kid, the car. We had everything but the picket fence. It was good. Michael had a steady job as a manager at a supermarket in Austin, Texas. And on August 12, 1986, Michael and his family celebrated his birthday at a local restaurant before returning home. Before he left on the morning of August 13th, Michael left Christine a note. In the note, Michael wrote how much he loved her, but was disappointed that they didn't have sex the night before. Michael left at 5:30 a.m., as Eric and Christine were still sleeping. That afternoon, as Michael drove down the street, he froze. His home had been cordoned off with crime scene tape, and there was a swarm of officers. Michael ran towards his home, but was stopped. Officers informed him that they had found Christine beaten to death. Michael's world crumbled around him. Thankfully, their son Eric, who was in the home, was uninjured. Officers determined that Christine had been beaten with a wooden object as she lay in her bed. A small patch of male fluid was also found on the bed, but DNA testing was unavailable at that time. The note heavily influenced their view of Michael, and they also learned that he'd arrived at work a half hour late that morning. Eric, who was just 3 years old at the time of the attack, was gently questioned by the Austin PD. He had said that a monster had attacked his mummy and that Daddy wasn't there. Neighbors of the Mortons had reported seeing a strange man in a green van close to Morton's home on the day of the murder. The man repeatedly parked his van on a nearby street before walking into a wooded area. Despite no physical evidence to tie Michael to the scene, he was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. Days into the investigation, a bloody bandana was found 90 meters from the Morton home, but this did little to change Michael's fate. According to the Innocence Project, the prosecution omitted vital evidence at trial, such as the fact that Christine's missing credit card had been used in San Antonio at a jewelry store, as well as a check that Christine hadn't cashed yet had been cashed after her murder and after Michael had been arrested. The prosecution didn't call the chief investigator, Don Woods, to testify during Michael's trial. The prosecution claimed that Michael had killed his wife in the early morning hours because she refused to have sex with him. The Travis County medical examiner also estimated that Christine had been murdered at around 1:15 a.m., although he said that this was not a, quote, not a scientific statement. Months after Michael was arrested and he was found guilty of murdering his wife Christine and sentenced to life in prison. Michael filed several appeals, none of which were successful. Michael and his legal team also rallied to have the bandana tested for DNA, but this was denied by the state. Thankfully, in 2011, this ruling was overturned. The blood and hair found on the bandana was tested, revealing Christine's DNA, which was to be expected because it was her bandana. But also found was the DNA of another man, Mark Allen Norwood. Due to the new findings, Michael Morton was exonerated after 25 years and released from prison. 2 years later, in 2013, Mark Norwood was tried and found guilty of Christine's murder and sentenced to life in prison. In 2016, Mark Norwood was found guilty of the murder of Deborah Baker, who was found murdered in her home in Austin, Texas in 1988.
Morton and Norwood, two names tied together by a brutal murder. Yet, here they both were, happy to meet each other.
I'm glad I met you both.
Take care of yourself. So many things have happened because of that August morning in 1986, when these names were forever linked. Michael Morton went to prison, an innocent man, for 25 years for his wife Christine's murder. Dorothy Norwood truly believes her son Mark is now living the same nightmare.
My son? Well, first off, he's innocent, and I guess I should know it because these last years we've lived together.
The jury took just 3 hours. The key piece of evidence, Morton blood, Norwood DNA, once again, together on the same blue bandana. It was enough to end any ideas of innocence in Michael's mind.
You can talk about contamination, you can talk about all the what ifs, we don't know exactly what happened, but that one thing was really hard for me to get around.
After this day, the two names, the two families will go on their own ways. But before they did, Norwood and Morton locked each other close. It was like they have been all along and always will be.
You feel it, a common spirit between some people, and some people you don't. We do, I think.
time has made it possible so that we can go on without too much animosity or anger. It's a big exhalation.
Michael has since found peace with himself, as well as those involved with his incarceration. He was awarded a lump sum payment based on the number of years he was wrongly incarcerated for an annual annuity of $80,000 per year. He was able to reconnect with his son, who had cut ties with him as a teen. Eric had been adopted by Christine's sister and for many years believed his father to have killed his mother.
Thank God this wasn't a capital case, that I only had life, because it gave the saints here at the Innocence Project time to do this. I'd like to thank them and Judge Harrell. I thank you also for giving it the attention that it deserves and it needs. And I thank you for respecting the fact that there are a lot of things that I can't say right now, because I still have this hanging over my head.
Deborah Baker's daughter holds Ken Anderson, the original prosecutor in the case, personally responsible for her mother's death. She believes that he cut corners and allowed a predator to walk the streets for decades after Christine Morton's murder, which in turn allowed Norwood the opportunity to murder her mother. Ken Anderson was later disbarred, and his license to practice law was revoked when it was discovered he willfully withheld evidence to the defense in Michael's case. Number 3. George Allen. In the 1980s, 26-year-old George Allen Jr. resided in University City, Missouri, surrounded by his friends and family. George had been diagnosed as schizophrenic years earlier and had been hospitalized several times, but was undergoing treatment. On March 14, 1982, George had a chance encounter with a police officer that would change his life forever. Whilst walking, George was approached by an officer who had mistaken him for another man, Kirk Eaton. Eaton was a prime suspect in the murder of 31-year-old Mary Bell. On February 4, 1982, Mary was found in her St. Louis apartment. She'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. The scene was brutal, with the knife being located in a blood-soaked towel near the front door. George, who officers believed to be Eaton, was taken to a nearby police station for further questioning. According to reports, partway into the interview, officers realized their mistake, but decided to carry on interrogating George anyway. George, who had a history of severe mental illness, was under the influence of alcohol and had no grasp of what was happening to him. The intense pressure of the situation broke him down, and he ended up confessing to not only murdering Mary Bell, but several other sexual assaults. George's confession was recorded, and as reported by the Innocence Project, quote, "The detective asked highly leading questions and prompted George to give him answers to fit the crime, often asking George change his answer to do so. The information that George gave directly contradicted to the crime scene, but the St. Louis police arrested him and charged him with murder anyways." At trial, the prosecution entered forensic evidence in the form of semen fluid that was found on Mary's body. At the time, Mary also had a boyfriend that lived with her. According to reports, blood tests were used because DNA was not available. These blood tests showed that the sample contained A and H antigens, which allegedly did not conclusively rule George out as a suspect. This was the only piece of evidence that the prosecution put forward. Witnesses recalled that on February 2, 1982, University City as well as St. Louis had encountered a snowstorm, and most residents found themselves trapped in feet of snow. It would have taken a significant effort and time for George to have cleared his way out of the 20-foot snow to Mary's apartment. No other forensic evidence, such as fibers or fingerprints, were found linking George to the scene. George suffered through 2 trials, as the first trial was declared a mistrial after a deadlocked jury. At his second trial, George Allen Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to 95 years in prison. George and his team appealed the decision, but his conviction was upheld at every turn. In the 90s, the Innocence Project began working with George and his family, but it wasn't until 2012 that the truth finally came out. Thanks to the diligent work of the Innocence Project, new evidence came to light.
It's been 30 years of unspeakable heartache for Mr. Allen and for his family. He has a lot of support, not only from his family, but from the community, as you can see here today. And they just want this nightmare to finally be over.
This evidence included tests that excluded George and Mary's boyfriend as suspects in the case. Moreover, the DNA found on Mary's clothing was found to be her boyfriend's, not George's. The blood test evidence had been purposely hidden, turning the trial to fight the prosecution's agenda. Finally, in November 2012, George Allen Jr. was exonerated and was released from prison. George spent nearly 30 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit due to tunnel vision by law enforcement.
I have spent 30 years in prison as an innocent man, and those have been difficult years for me and my family. But I never gave up hope. I knew that someday the truth would come out, and now that day is here. I look forward to living with my family again and getting on with my life. I thank my mother and family for standing by me all these years, and I thank my attorneys at the Innocent Project and Brian Kay for helping me. Thank God this nightmare is finally ending.
In 2013, the case against George was officially dismissed, but George would only experience 2 years of freedom before he passed away in 2014. 4 years later, George's family received $14 million from a federal civil rights lawsuit that had been filed in 2014. Number 2. William Barnhouse. On April 21, 1992, officers in Muncie, Indiana, received a call from a terrified woman. She called to report that she'd been sexually assaulted and that her attacker had ridden away on a bicycle. Officers quickly arrived at the scene, a vacant lot, and began taking the woman's statement. The victim told investigators that her attacker had forced her up against a wall before assaulting her 3 times. Muncie officers took the woman into their car and reassured her that she was now safe. She told law enforcement that she would never forget the face of the man who did this to her, which gave them an idea. They believed that the woman's attacker would be someone in the local area, and according to the Innocence Project, they canvassed the neighborhood until they came across a few men that fit the profile. One of these men was 35-year-old William Barnhouse, who was out minding his own business. In a flash, officers told William to line up with the other men. Here they were told they were possible suspects in a sexual assault that had occurred hours earlier. Confused and terrified, William was frozen in fear as police officers shone flashlights into their eyes. The victim immediately pointed to William, crying to the police that he'd been the one to attack her. Based on her identification, William Barnhouse was arrested and taken into police custody. While William was being interviewed, sample swabs were taken from the victim and the clothes she wore at the time of the attack. In 1992, DNA was slowly making its way onto the scene, but it was very new and misunderstood technology. These sample swabs were analyzed, and according to the Innocence Project, the analyst who oversaw this, quote, could not eliminate William as a source of the evidence based on blood type analysis. Aside from the woman's identification in the lineup, there was no other evidence to link William to the crime. The DNA evidence did not conclusively prove that William's DNA had been found in the woman's jeans, only that he could not be ruled out. The evidence was incredibly shaky, but Williams was taken to trial on December 1992. At trial, the prosecution also called forward another forensic expert who presented a single hair as evidence. The analysis stated that only William's hair standard matched the singular microscopic hair found on the victim's clothing. No DNA testing was performed on the hair at the time, and the prosecution was confident with their evidence presentation. The jury was swayed by the arguments put forth by the prosecution, especially the hair. Despite no sound evidence linking William to the crime, he was found guilty and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Williams had suffered from severe mental health issues his whole life, and many believe the police took advantage of this. Despite being faced with an 80-year-long prison sentence, William didn't lose hope. Many years into his sentence, he contacted the Innocence Project, which began looking into his case with a team of experts and lawyers. In 2016, the state of Indiana allowed external DNA testing to be performed on the semen samples obtained from the victim's clothing. This analysis also confirmed that the DNA found in the kit and the clothing belonged to the same man. That wasn't William. Moreover, the Associated Press reported that Williams had been born with a chromosomal condition that left him unable to produce sperm. After decades of being held behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, 62-year-old William Barnhouse was released on March 8, 2017. In 2019, Barnhouse filed a federal lawsuit against Muncie County, which included several of its police officers and employees of the Indiana State Police Crime Lab. He settled the lawsuit for $860,000 in 2021. Number 1. Clemente Aguirre. At around 9 a.m. on June 17, 2004, the lives of the Williams and Barres families changed forever when the bodies of 47-year-old Cheryl Williams and her mother, 68-year-old Carol Barres, were found at their homes in Altamonte Springs, Florida. A relative had stopped by their house to collect some items, but when he walked inside, he discovered that there was blood everywhere. Reports indicate that Cheryl had suffered the most extensive injuries out of the two, and she'd been stabbed over 129 times. Carol, who was particularly vulnerable following a stroke, had been left paralyzed, was still in her wheelchair, and had been stabbed twice. The relative, Mark Van Sant, along with the boyfriend of Cheryl's daughter, Samantha Williams, ran to the nearest phone after making the horrific discovery. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found a bloodied knife halfway between Cheryl's home and their next-door neighbors. Suspicion was immediately cast onto the next-door neighbor, 24-year-old Clemente Aguirre, who lived with two other people. Investigators quickly discovered that Clemente worked at a restaurant, and that the bloody knife found between his home and the victims resembled one that had disappeared from the restaurant in the days before the attack. When officers entered Clemente's home, they found a bag filled with bloody clothes. Samantha, Cheryl's daughter and Carol's granddaughter, told investigators she had a strong feeling that Clemente was somehow involved in the murders. When Clemente was brought in for questioning, he dropped a bombshell. He confessed to investigators that he'd been to Cheryl and Carol's home before 9 a.m. that morning. He went on to say that he'd gone into their house to ask for some beers when he came across Cheryl and Carol's body in the home. He claimed that he ran over to them to see if they were still alive and if CPR was possible, but it was too late. When asked why he didn't call the authorities, Clemente sheepishly answered that he was frightened of the authorities as he was an undocumented immigrant from Honduras and was afraid of being deported. The bloody knife, the bloody clothing, and the confession that he'd been in the home that morning were all investigators needed, and in June, Clemente was charged with 2 counts of murder. He explained that he had found the knife when he'd went over, and instinctually grabbed it in case the attacker was still in the home. He later threw it outside onto the grass. One of Clemente's fingerprints was found on the knife. However, it was later revealed that this fingerprint had not been suitable for comparison and had been incorrectly identified. He was arrested and charged with double murder. In 2006, Clemente stood before the jury that would decide his fate. At the time, the evidence against him was compelling, and analysts had not yet realized their mistake with the fingerprint. After weeks of arguments and evidence presented, the jury was ready to make their verdict: guilty. Clemente Aguirre was sentenced to death.
I didn't do it. I don't kill nobody.
A year after his conviction, analysts realized that the fingerprint found on the knife had not been suitable for comparison, and Clemente continued to file his appeals. In 2011, Clemente worked with the Innocence Project to obtain DNA testing, which had never previously been requested by Clemente's legal counsel during his initial trial. These tests found that Clemente's DNA was not the source found at the scene, and in fact, the possible suspect was much closer to home. According to the Innocence Project, Samantha Williams' DNA was found in 8 locations that the defense contended were consistent with her being the attacker. Several motions and appeals have been filed, and the legal process to have Clemente exonerated is complicated and messy. The state has ordered that Clemente be retried, with one judge remarking that this new evidence would not have seen Clemente acquitted. In 2018, Clemente was exonerated and released from death row, but may still face deportation if he's not allowed to seek asylum. The Innocence Project is currently working to have Clemente declared a wrongfully convicted person, and this ruling will allow Clemente to seek compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. It appears that Clemente's case is ongoing, and the Innocence Project has petitioned to help with Clemente's case. Samantha Williams later confessed to murdering her mother and grandmother. She had a history of severe mental illness and had been known to outburst violently when angry, and she admitted she had fought with her mother the night before she murdered her. She later said that, quote, "The demons made me do it." Clemente's legal team filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for his wrongful conviction, and he was ultimately awarded $720,000.
Hello, my name is Clemente Aguirre. I'm from Honduras. I was exonerated 48 hours ago. Thanks to God and the Innocent Projects, who bring me a group of attorneys who fought for my freedom. 14 years, 4 months, and 19 days I've been incarcerated. 10 years, 3 months of them in death row. But today is a brighter day, a new day, and I got good hopes for the future.
Good afternoon, and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you're new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. Today we're discussing 3 more cold cases suggested by the community. Let's get into it. Number 1, Timothy Dees. Timothy Dees, a 26-year-old man, went missing from Madison County on February 27th of this year and has not been found. Timothy resided in Creve Coeur, Missouri. Timothy had worked for 6 years at the St. Louis Local 6 as a stage rigger. He worked at different arenas in the St. Louis area. His family said that Timothy loved setting up concerts and working with the stage lighting. Timothy was last seen by his mother, Barbara Hall, on Friday, February 25th, when he left her home in Jefferson County. He was going to Fredericktown in Madison County with Caleb Nanny, a childhood friend, and they intended to spend the weekend together. When Timothy didn't call her over the weekend, Barbara began to worry. He always called or texted to let his mother know he was okay. It was a habit for him to text his mom and call her frequently after his brother died. He knew his mother would be worried about him. After Barbara did not hear from her son all weekend, she tried to call his phone. Timothy had not set up his voicemail, so she could not leave a message. This was normal for Timothy, so no surprise there. But when she tried texting his phone, the text didn't go through and she knew something was wrong. Around 1 a.m. in the early morning hours on Monday, February 28th, Timothy was last seen on surveillance in a local gas station in Fredericktown. He withdrew $160 and proceeded to play the slot machines. He looked alive and well, and not in distress, according to the sheriff's department. 3 hours later, around 4:40 a.m., a 911 call comes into the Madison County Dispatch Center. According to the dispatch, the 911 recorder was down in December of the previous year, and a new one was not installed until the middle of March the next year. After the call, Barbara said that deputies responded to a house on Village Creek Road in Madison County where the 911 call originated from. There, they proceeded to arrest the friend that Timothy had been traveling with on warrants. Barbara goes on to state that the deputies never questioned the residents about Timothy's whereabouts, even though they knew he was reported missing. According to Barbara, Madison County Sheriff's Department has been no help. Kathy McCutcheon, the sheriff, says that her department has addressed every lead. She states that she's been working with the Missouri Highway State Patrol and assisted them in the investigation. A few days after Timothy's disappearance, Barbara received a call from Caleb, the friend that Timothy left to go to Fredericktown with for the weekend, via a video conference call from jail. Unprompted, Caleb proceeds to tell Barbara that he would never hurt Timothy and that he would do everything he could to find him. Barbara said that Caleb had not been any help because his story kept changing every time she spoke with him. Barbara is still adamant that the Madison County Sheriff's Department has done nothing to help with the investigation. Barbara travels to Madison County daily to distribute flyers and speak with residents. There are a lot of unanswered questions about Timothy's disappearance that Barbara would like answered. One of the questions is why deputies did not inquire about Timothy's whereabouts when they were dispatched to the residence after the 911 call was made. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. Number 2, Daniel Morgan. On March 10, 1987, Daniel Morgan, a Welsh private investigator in London, went for a drink with his business partner Jonathan Rees at the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham. Daniel, 37, and Rees sat at the pub and had a single drink each. They departed shortly after, going their separate ways around 9 p.m. 40 minutes later, a man found Daniel in the parking lot of the pub on the ground. Daniel was declared deceased at the scene, with the murder weapon, a hatchet, still embedded in his head. It was a gruesome murder and one that had shocked locals in the area. Daniel Morgan's family had also immediately been concerned about the coming investigation. Daniel's brother knew that he'd been working on a case regarding police corruption, and it had been an immediate concern that someone within the local police force had caught wind. No one had come forward as witness, despite several pleas from the media. The hatchet had been a common general store make and model without any unique identifiers, but the killer had placed 2 bandages around the handle to act as grip. Initially, the case was assigned to Sid Fillery, a detective sergeant at the Catford police station, and he had handled the collection of the crime scene evidence, the initial witness statements, and documenting the process. Months later, it was revealed that Fillery had been working with Jonathan Rees. Fillery had been the one to interrogate Rees, but hadn't disclosed that the two were friends. After which Fillery, Rees, and 2 other police officers, along with Rees' brother-in-laws, were arrested but later released. Fillery was removed from the case, but he resigned from the police department altogether and joined Rees in replacing Daniel Morgan in the private investigation business. There had been several allegations that Daniel and Jonathan were having several differences of opinion regarding the business. Rees was very well connected with the police department, whereas Daniel kept his distance. Daniel didn't trust the police department, concerned about corruptions within the ranks. One witness stated that Rees had conspired to have Daniel murdered to get him out of the business, even revealing that Sid Fillery had been brought in to replace Daniel once he was taken care of. Rees and Fillery denied this conversation took place, but it is what happened after Daniel's murder. The statements were deemed as not corroborated, as there had been no additional witnesses, and the witness who made the statement was under investigation for fraud and therefore deemed not reputable. Months later, a former employer came forward saying that Daniel had approached him about asking for help selling a story to the newspaper about police corruption, solidifying the belief that Daniel was killed because of the article he was working on. In 1989, Jonathan Rees was arrested a second time for the murder of Daniel Morgan, and this time he was charged. However, the charges were eventually dropped. Meanwhile, the Morgan family were continuing to keep the case in the media and keep pressuring lawmakers and detectives and papers to keep the case alive. Detectives decided to set up surveillance within the office of Rees and Fillery. They discovered that the two were working closely with tabloid newspapers, and their clientele became less than honest. The two were hired by a man to plant drugs on his ex-wife before a custody hearing, so his ex-wife would be deemed an unfit parent by the courts and he wouldn't have to pay child support. It hadn't been the evidence they were looking for, but law enforcement had to intervene and blow the undercover surveillance operation. Rees was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit a crime and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Over the passing decades, the case remains unsolved. Rees is now out of prison but is still a suspect to have been involved with Daniel Morgan's murder. The Metropolitan Police have been under incredible scrutiny since this case. Several audits have revealed deep and systematic corruption within law enforcement that really hasn't been addressed. Rees had deep connections and had help from officers. Fillery had been a detective for many years and, in addition to knowing police protocols, was also well connected. The undercover surveillance had revealed one instance where they'd been willing to commit a crime in order to make a buck. And that surveillance had happened years after Rees and Fillery had gone into business together. It wouldn't be a stretch to conclude that they might have done this before. In that case, 2 officers had also been arrested in connection with the crime for planting the drugs on an innocent woman. Those aren't the kind of officers you want investigating the man who was murdered for trying to bring to light corrupt officers. In 2021, Morgan's brother Alistair is still raising awareness and meeting with law enforcement to try and get action taken. In a recent report expressing concerns about the corruption within the Metropolitan Police, they said, "A culture still exists that inhibits both organizational and individual accountability." The family of Daniel Morgan suffered grievously as a consequence of the failure to bring his family justice. The unwarranted assurances which were given, the misinformation which was put into the public domain, and the denial of failings on the investigation, including failing to acknowledge professional competence, individuals' venal behavior, and managerial and organizational failures. The Metropolitan Police have also repeatedly failed to take a fresh, thorough, and critical look at past failings, concealing or denying failings for the sake of the organization's public image. Is dishonesty on the part of the organization for reputational benefit and constitutes a form of institutional corruption.
It happened in 1987. The body of Daniel Morgan, a father of 2 young children, was found one night in March in a South London car park.
Daniel Morgan's brother Alistair believes he was executed.
An axe was embedded in his head. Some still maintain the private detective was poised to sell a story about drug-related police corruption.
For nearly 30 hours, they did hold for questioning Daniel Morgan's partner, John Rees, and 2 of Rees's relations.
His former business partner, Jonathan Rees, who mixed in police circles, would twice be charged in connection with the murder.
And this is the car park.
Jonathan Rees has always maintained his innocence. He and others connected to the case spoke about the murder in a Channel 4 documentary last year.
There was no evidence ever of us being involved in the murder of Daniel Morgan. What's difficult about that?
Today the panel said it couldn't conclude that there was police involvement in the murder, but the subsequent investigation suffered from deliberate police corruption from the outset.
Number 3, Shane McLaughlin. Shane McLaughlin was just 15 years old when he first went missing from his mother's home in Romulus, Michigan, in Metro Detroit. He was eventually found and returned, but then decided to move in with a relative to attend high school. He was last seen leaving his residence at 10:48 on the evening of October 28, 2020. He was captured on camera getting into a dark-colored SUV, possibly a Dodge Jeep or Durango, and had a Nike duffel bag with him. Shane has a heartbeat tattoo on the side of his left arm and both ears pierced. On October 18, 2021, Crime Stoppers and the team's family marked the first anniversary since anyone had seen or heard from the teen. Crime Stoppers of Michigan was offering a $2,500 reward for any information. Shane's mother, Nicole Quarles, is seen on TV tearfully asking for just a phone call from her son to let her know that he is safe. Not to return home, but just to call. Shane then surfaced in a TikTok video. The video showed Shane with his missing poster in the background and a medical mask on, alleging he left home because he was physically and emotionally abused. In the TikTok video, he claimed that he'd suffered from mental issues since he was 14, and when he asked for help from his mother, she would tell him to get over it. The TikTok videos have since been removed. According to Shane, he alerted police and child services about the abuse, and he alleged that no one would help him, so he chose to leave on his own. Saying in the video, "I'm doing great on my own. I'm doing fine. I don't need nobody. You guys might think because I'm young I need someone to rely on, but I don't. I'm perfectly capable of living by myself. There's no one that I need in life. I just want to be alone." Quarles then acknowledged in her own TikTok video that this is indeed her son, but denied the abuse claims. She stated that Shane had been counseling for anxiety, but was experiencing difficulties at home. She said that she believes he has been brainwashed, and she fears for his life and will not stop looking for him. Quarles said that she and the police know the woman that is helping Shane. She lives near Quarles, and Quarles had taken out a personal protective order against the woman. Quarles said that despite the court order, the older woman had not kept her distance from her, so that court action would take place. She stated that if Shane agrees to meet with the police so that they can determine his well-being, she will call off the search. She has stated that she believes that Shane was groomed by the older woman and that the two have been in some sort of relationship. According to the Romulus police, Shane is still considered a voluntary missing person. Law enforcement have stated that there isn't any evidence to prove Shane was abused, nor his siblings. However, they have stated that once Shane turns 18, he will not be required to return to his family, but they would like him to reach out so that they can make sure he's okay. As of right now, the case remains open. This case is kind of unique, but because Shane is still a minor, and given his age and the allegations made on both sides, it is paramount that law enforcement know he is okay, and that there wasn't anything criminal with his disappearance. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Romulus Police Department.
Shane McLaughlin has been missing since Sunday, October the 18th of 2020. He was last seen at 10:48 p.m. on surveillance video getting into a dark-colored SUV, possibly a Dodge Journey or Jeep, in the city of Romulus. The SUV drove off and Shane has not been seen or heard from since by his family or friends. He was 15 years old when he went missing.
I want to let you know, Shane, if you're watching this, nobody's mad at you, your mom's not mad at you, and we just want you home safe. And even if you don't want to come home, just call somebody just so we know you're alright and safe.
Shane, if you're out there and you're watching, we love you and we miss you. We want you to come home, and if you don't want to come home, at least call somebody and let us know that you're okay. We don't know if you're alive, we don't know if you're safe, we don't know anything, and we want to know. We love and we miss you so much. Please call or come home if you can.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 child abduction cold cases. There are hopes that these children were kidnapped to be raised in another family and may be able to be given their true identities and reunited with their families. We had 2 abducted child cases solved last year. With these cases, you never know who might see these stories and who might hold a key piece of evidence needed to solve these cold cases. But with that being said, let's get into it. Number 4, Elias Monroy. It was on Monday, February 2nd, 1987, when Maria Pacheco took her newborn son Elias Monroy Jr. for a routine checkup at the LA USC Medical Center in Los Angeles. Elias was only 2 weeks old and was born happy and healthy, but it had been a difficult delivery for Maria. Maria was still recovering from a cesarean section and was experiencing a lot of pain, which was making it difficult to walk and get around. While in the clinic waiting room, Maria was approached by a woman in her 30s, who said she was a mother as well. The two chatted for a bit, and Maria thought the woman was friendly and honest. So when Elias started to cry, Maria dug through her diaper bag, but realized she didn't bring enough bottles. The woman offered to hold Elias while she went to look for some formula, and Maria accepted. Maria had only been gone for a few minutes. When she returned, she noticed the woman was gone, and so was her son. At first, it was thought that the woman had simply gone into her appointment and had taken the newborn with her, but no one matching her description was identified as a patient there or had an appointment. Little Elias had been kidnapped. When detectives started investigating the abduction, detectives in Hesperia, California reached out with a similar abduction attempt on January 14th. In that case, a woman who had similarities to the description of the LA abductor approached a woman in a post office who was with her 4-month-old son. This woman had started chatting with the mother and had asked to hold the baby, which the mother declined. She left the post office and continued running her errands. Later on in the day, she arrived at a Safeway. She parked and was unbuckling her son from the car seat when she noticed the woman from the post office barreling towards her. The woman was screaming, "I want the baby, I want the baby," and tried to rip the little boy from his mother's arms. And it was then that she noticed that there was a man with the woman this time. The mother kicked at the woman, knocking her back. Then the man tried to take the child from her arms, and she kicked him as well, getting him between the legs, and she ran with her child into the grocery store. She was helped by the store employees, but the 2 child abductors ran off. By the time law enforcement arrived, they were long gone. The woman was described as Hispanic, 30 to 35 years old, around 5'7" and 150 pounds. Both said that she had a dark complexion, and Maria said that the woman had long brown hair but the ends were frosted blonde. The mother didn't get a good look at the man, and there wasn't a description of him. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of Elias, but a new age progression image has been generated to show what he may look like today. Elias is Hispanic with brown hair and brown eyes. At the time of his abduction, he weighed 8 pounds and was 1 foot 9 inches long. He would be 36 years old today, and it is believed he was abducted by a woman to be raised as her own. He may still be in the California area. He may believe he was adopted as a child. Maria put out a plea out to social media saying, quote, "Elias, look for me, communicate with me. I am your mom, and you were my dream come true, but someone took you from me." The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is very hopeful in identifying Elias and reuniting him with his family. Anyone who recognizes Elias from the age progression image or the sketch of the abductor is asked to contact the LAPD at 1-877-ASK-LAPD or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Number 3. Christopher Bush. It was on April 5, 1975, when 2-year-old Christopher Bush was left unattended in a vehicle at a grocery store parking lot in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had been left in the care of a babysitter, 26-year-old Patricia Warwick, at the time, and had been with her for 2 weeks prior following a fire that destroyed the Bush home. Christopher's mother, Gwendolyn, was staying with relatives with her 3 other children. Patricia Warwick had offered to look after Christopher while they found a new home that would accommodate all of the children again. When Patricia returned to the 1966 maroon Ford station wagon after shopping, she discovered that Christopher wasn't there. All that was left was the hat that he'd been wearing. She searched the surrounding area but found no sign of the toddler, finally calling the police an hour later. Precious time had been lost, and the investigation turned up little information. Over 100 officers searched for days, but nothing came up. Patricia swore that she had left the car doors locked. There was no sign of a break-in. However, someone could have easily convinced Christopher to unlock the door. Car seats weren't mandatory in the US until 1986, so it's likely that he was just sitting in the back seat. Alternatively, she might have forgotten to check all the doors of the car. Either way, someone got in. Patricia claimed that she'd only been in the store for 10 minutes before coming back to the vehicle, so the window for the abduction was relatively short. Christopher Bush is described at the time of his abduction as a black male, 2'10" and 40 pounds. He was wearing a denim jacket with a white fur-trimmed collar and a light blue corduroy pants. He was born in 1973 and may have been adopted out in 1975. The case remains unsolved, and there's been little movement in the case since 1975, though there are hopes that he will be found and reunited with his family. Christopher would have been 50 years old today and may have grown up in the Pennsylvania area. Number 2. Cynthia Lynn Sumter. It was on April 27, 1974, when 5-year-old Cynthia Lynn Sumter was playing outside on the front lawn of the apartment building she lived in with her mother in San Jose, California. Cynthia's mother, Linda, left around noon to pick up sandwiches for lunch, but while she was gone, she asked a neighbor to watch her daughter. When she returned about an hour later, Cynthia hadn't come in for lunch yet. She looked outside but couldn't see her out front. For 30 minutes she searched by herself, but opted to call the police, who gathered a 50-person search party to look for the little girl. Dozens of leads came in, but it appeared that the girl had vanished without a trace. One lead from a witness stated that they saw a little girl matching Cynthia's description in a blue car driven by a young man with blonde hair and a mustache. However, this sighting was never confirmed by a secondary witness, so it's hard to know if this was a credible sighting. Days after her disappearance, a neighbor reached out to Linda and threatened that she needed to drop the criminal charge against his brother to see Cynthia again, along with $1,000 cash. 5 weeks before the abduction, Cynthia had been molested by a boy who lived next door. Linda had pressed criminal charges. It was determined that the boys didn't have Cynthia and were charged with attempted extortion. Cynthia's parents had divorced a year earlier, and in the early days of the investigation, both accused the other of kidnapping the child. Both were investigated and asked to take polygraph tests, which they both passed. They were ultimately ruled out as suspects. Another suspect was Antonio Madrid, a neighbor who lived 100 yards from the apartment building. Madrid committed suicide 2 days after the abduction. Law enforcement later found a shirt with blood on it and blonde hairs in his vehicle. It is unclear if genetic testing had been done on those items. Convicted killer Eugene Joseph Wesley was also investigated about Cynthia's disappearance. While connected to a polygraph machine, it showed deception, leading detectives to believe he knew more than he was saying. However, law enforcement stopped investigating him when he died in prison. At the time of her disappearance, Cynthia is wearing a red and white striped tank top with a blue star on the front and purple pants. She was barefoot. She is described as white with blonde hair and blue eyes. She has a cow look on the right side of her hairline and a mole on the left side of her neck and shin. Her nickname is Cindy, and she often went by both Cindy or Cynthia. Linda believes Cynthia is still alive. A body was never found, nor any evidence that would point to the contrary. In a statement to the media, she said, quote, "I pray every day that God will bring her back into my life sometime here on this earth, not just in heaven, that I can hold her one more time and tell her how much I loved her." The San Jose Police Department is hopeful in solving the cold case and is asking anyone with information to come forward, as without it, the case will likely go unsolved. In a statement to the media, they said, quote, "Even after this many years, someone out there has information that can be helpful to the San Jose police. We won't close this case until she is physically found." Number 1. Krista Nicole Belusco. It was on September 20th, 1991 on Staten Island, New York, when the body of a woman was discovered in a patch of weeds along a dirt road. The woman had been handcuffed, severely beaten with a hammer, and strangled to death. Her body was then set ablaze. The murder weapon was found under her body with the name Lloyd L. carved into the handle. The woman remained unidentified for 3 decades, known for all those years as Jane Doe with a scorpion tattoo. The cold case was opened in 2023 when familial DNA gave her name back as Christine Belusco. Christine was 30 years old at the time of her murder. She'd been a missing person since September 13, 1991, when she was last seen by family members. Christine had recently learned that she was adopted and had a falling out with her parents, who hadn't told her about the adoption until she was an adult. It had been a shock to Christine, and she told her family she was moving to Florida. That was the last she had been seen. Her family had no idea she'd been dead all these years. Her brother was the one to receive the notice that Christine had been identified as a Jane Doe. He asked if they had also found Krista. It was only then that law enforcement learned that Christine had a child who'd been with her at the last time she'd been seen. Her daughter had only been 2 at the time. Krista Nicole Belusco was last seen with her mother at the Mount Airy Lodge in Mount Ponoco, Pennsylvania. Her family never knew who her father was. Law enforcement believe that finding Christine's killer will lead to finding Krista. They believe that Christine was killed by someone she knew and are hoping that finding the identity of Krista's father will point them in the right direction. Krista Nicole will be 33 years old today. Her birthday was August 1st, 1989. She is described as Caucasian with brown hair and brown eyes. If you recognize Krista Nicole or know anything about the murder of Christine Belusco, call the Richmond County District Attorney's Office at 718-556-7085.
In September 1991, someone put her in these handcuffs and brutally beat her to death using this hammer.
We know that she was strangled, we know that she was beaten, and we know that the body was burned. It was a cruel and vicious killing. The men and women who work in my office, the prosecutors and investigators, don't give up, and they fight every day to bring justice to the victims of crime.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 cold case missing persons cases. As always, covering these cases and shedding some light on them might be the final piece of a puzzle needed to solve these cases. But with that being said, let's get into it. Number 3. Susan Marie Powell. It was 1999. Cosmetology student Susan Cox met Joshua Powell at a dinner party in Tacoma, Washington. Joshua and Susan were devout followers of the Church of Jesus of Latter-day Saints, and the spark between the two was undeniable. Friends close to the couple claimed that within a few days of meeting each other, Joshua had already proposed and the two had set in motion plans to spend the rest of their lives together. Susan was utterly smitten with Josh, and in 2001, the pair got married in a traditional LDS ceremony. Following their marriage, the two moved in with Josh's father, Stephen Powell, in South Hill, Puyallup, Utah. Stephen welcomed his daughter-in-law with open arms, but his behavior soon took a turn for the worse. Susan had gotten a job as a broker at Wells Fargo, and to the outside world all seemed well. Josh and Susan were thriving, but behind closed doors, evil was lurking. Stephen had taken a particular liking to Susan. In the 3 years the couple lived with him, his behavior escalated to stealing her underwear to filming her without her consent. Susan was disgusted by Stephen's behavior and attitude towards her, and things came to a head when she discovered he'd been writing love songs dedicated to her. He would later tell the Today Show, quote, "I wasn't going to turn down an opportunity with this beautiful woman, even though she's my son's wife." One of the songs, titled "Waiting for You," included lyrics such as, quote, "I could be getting a mistaken impression. Each time you seem to gaze at me, you let me touch you softly. Why is the question and the effect amazes me." In 2004, the Powells were relieved when they moved to West Valley City and finally got away from Stephen. Little did Susan know that Stephen's bizarre behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. She had jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. The fire being Josh's controlling and abusive behavior. Now that the two were alone, Josh exerted complete control over his wife, making her life miserable. He began to withdraw from the LDS Church, something that Susan was passionate about, and he remained in close contact with his father, Stephen, despite his inappropriate behavior towards Susan. By 2007, Susan and Josh had welcomed 2 sons, Charles, born 2005, and Braden, born 2007. Susan dove headfirst into motherhood and was known to be a loving and devoted mother. She juggled her job as a broker with her job as a parent, whilst Josh was in between jobs. It was apparent to those outside the marriage that cracks were beginning to show. Susan was the primary breadwinner, and Josh was living a lifestyle well beyond their means. Josh's spending habits and withdrawal from the LDS Church began to grate on Susan, and the pair became distant. Susan recorded a disturbing video in which she said, "This is me, July 29th, 2008, covering all my bases, making sure that if anything happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented."
July 29th, 2008. It is 12:33 Mountain Time. Covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after as much as that's possible.
She panned the camera around the home, but it was clear that Susan's message had a double meaning. Como News reported that in June 2008, Susan had written a new will in secret. The will in part read, quote, "I want it to be documented somewhere that there is extreme turmoil in our marriage. Josh threatened that if we get a divorce, there will be no lawyers, only a church mediator, and I will ruin you." She also stated that Josh had told her, quote, "You, Susan, will be destroyed and your life would be over and the boys will not grow up with a mom and dad." Final paragraph chillingly read, quote, "If I die, it was not an accident, even if it looks like one." Just over a year later, Susan Powell disappeared under mysterious circumstances. December 6, 2009 started like any other day for the Powells. Susan took her children to a church service before returning home. News outlet The Deserter provided an in-depth timeline of Susan's last known movements. The last person to see Susan was a neighbor who saw her around 5 p.m. Susan had made dinner for the family before taking a nap as she felt unwell. After this, what happened to Susan remains a complete mystery. The next day, on December 7, 2009, the West Valley City Police Department received a call from a babysitter of Charles and Braden. The pair failed to attend daycare that morning, and Josh and Susan were both unreachable. Their families had also tried to contact them to no avail. The West Valley City Police Department quickly began the search for the Powell family, fearing that the worst may have occurred. Hours later at 5 p.m., Joshua and the boys returned to the West Valley family home, without Susan. Josh's behavior was noted as very strange and erratic, and when officers entered the house earlier that day, they found that 2 fans had been blowing on a wet spot on the carpet. Susan's purse, wallet, and ID and bank cards were found inside the home, but her cell phone was missing. Upon his return, Josh told the investigators a bizarre story of how he had whisked his kids away on a late-night camping trip to Simpson Springs in Utah. He claimed that Susan had been asleep when he left because she felt unwell. Investigators found that hard to believe that Josh had taken 2 small children into the woods in the freezing December weather. Data indicated that on December 7th, Utah experienced highs of 7 degrees Celsius or 44 Fahrenheit, and lows of negative 17 Celsius and 1 degree Fahrenheit, with blizzard-like conditions. Investigators ordered a further examination of the Powell home, and at this time they found 2 crucial clues. Firstly was Susan's phone, which was found in the car Joshua had used on December 7th to take his kids camping. When questioned, Charles and Braden agreed that they'd been camping, but only after encouragement from their father. Second, forensic investigators found a blood stain on the carpet, and a DNA test proved that it belonged to Susan. There was still insufficient evidence for investigators to press charges, and the search continued. They also found life insurance policies for Susan worth over $1 million, and Susan's privately stashed will, letter, and video. Josh tried to return to normal following Susan's disappearance, despite the circumstances and the media circus that followed. News outlets quickly discovered Stephen's bizarre obsession with his daughter-in-law Susan, and soon the blame began to fall on Josh. Charles and Braden gave chilling accounts of what happened that cold December evening once they were away from the influence of their father. Charles told a teacher that Susan had been with them on their camping trip, but that she hadn't been alive. Braden also drew a picture of the van, similar to the Chrysler minivan the Powells owned, with the picture depicting his mother sleeping in the trunk of the car. Things would take a sickening turn in 2011 when the full scope of Stephen's obsession was revealed after he was arrested for voyeurism, inappropriate child materials. It was also around this time that Josh lost custody of his 2 sons, and they were placed in the care of their maternal grandparents. Investigators slowly began piecing together the puzzle and getting closer to arresting Josh. It became evident to investigators that Josh was a narcissist who emotionally abused his wife and controlled her life, but the unthinkable would happen before action could be taken. February 5th, 2012 is a date that Susan's parents will never forget. That afternoon, Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived at Josh's home with Charles and Braden for a supervised visit. Psychologist Dr. James Manley, who had undertaken Josh's psychological evaluation, noted that he suffered with adjustment disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Before Elizabeth could enter the door, Josh slammed it in her face. She heard the locks clicking from inside and immediately began to bang on the door. She told Josh to let her inside and desperately called 911 to get some backup. Elizabeth stood on the side of the road outside of the home, waiting for the police to arrive to retrieve the children. Just minutes later, the Powell home exploded and erupted in flames. Charles Joshua Powell was 7 years old. Braden Timothy Powell was just 5 years old. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late. Investigators found that Josh had taken an axe to his sons before dousing them in gasoline and setting the home on fire. He had sent an email to his lawyer stating that he was sorry, and he also sent goodbye messages to his family.
There are 2 overwhelming emotions out here this morning, deep sadness and also anger. Anger that these 2 little boys couldn't somehow be protected from their father, a man that so many people feared was a killer. The fire and apparent explosion was so powerful it shook neighbors' homes and sent bits of insulation from the house raining down on the neighborhood.
All of a sudden, the house shook and I ran outside and you can see this black smoke.
Minutes earlier, just before 12:30 Sunday afternoon, 7-year-old Charles and 5-year-old Braden Powell had been escorted into the home by a caseworker for a court-ordered visitation with their father, Josh Powell. Police say Powell forced the caseworker out, locked the doors. She saw flames and called 911, just as a series of blasts tore the house apart. Across town, Josh Powell's attorney says he received an email from Josh stamped 1205. It was 3 words: "I'm sorry. Goodbye."
This wasn't tragic. This was deeply wrong. This was evil. You do not kill little kids.
Police found 3 bodies in the center of the rubble, 2 children and an adult. They say there is no doubt that Josh Powell wanted to end his life and take his little boys with him, and say an accelerant was used to make the house burn quickly.
He grabbed the kids, locked her out of the house, and immediately the house went up in flames.
There he is. There he is. You see him?
Sources tell ABC News Powell's mood had changed drastically in recent days. He was more calm than usual, but also seemed excited about the future.
All right, come on.
He was last seen in public at this custody hearing on Wednesday, during which a judge ordered him to undergo a psychological examination and lie detector test while the kids remained with his missing wife's parents.
We're happy to have them with us. We want the best for the kids.
The decision was a blow to Powell, who recently lost custody of the 2 boys and remained the only person of interest in the disappearance of his wife, Susan. Josh told police that he last saw his wife around midnight in December of 2009, before taking his 2 sons on a late-night camping trip in the Utah desert.
You know, I got out to a pretty late start.
This morning, the Cox family, which first lost a daughter, is now dealing with the almost unbearable deaths of their grandsons.
Investigators were heartbroken by the conclusion of this bizarre situation. In 2013, Michael Powell, Josh's brother, who was also believed to have some involvement, also took his own life. Almost all possible suspects and witnesses in Susan's disappearance are now gone. Stephen didn't provide the police with any valuable information, and following his release in 2017, he too would pass away due to natural causes. This investigation had led the police on a wild goose chase, and despite thousands of dollars in cutting-edge techniques, the West Valley City Police Department were no closer to solving this case than they were in 2009. Investigators believe Susan's body may be buried somewhere in Simpson Springs or the surrounding Utah wilderness. With all potential witnesses and suspects now deceased, investigators are holding out for new information or evidence to surface. Susan's disappearance encompasses so many bizarre tales and stories, and it's hard to discern what is the truth and what is a red herring. Susan Marie Powell is described as a white female with brown highlighted hair, blue eyes, 5'4", and 130 pounds. She was last seen wearing a long-sleeved black shirt and black dress pants. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective David Greco of the West Valley City Police Department. Number 2. Angela Mae Meeker. Angela Mae Meeker was just 2 days away from her 14th birthday when she disappeared on July 7, 1979. Angela, who lived in Tacoma, Washington, was known to be a bright and outstanding young student. At the time of her disappearance, she was in junior high and was doing well. That afternoon, Angela headed to the Tacoma Mall to buy a birthday card for her friend. A friend of Angela's would later come forward, telling investigators that he had spotted Angela walking on the side of the road. This friend rolled down his window and discovered that Angela was headed for the mall. He offered her a ride, and Angela jumped into the passenger seat. According to this friend, he dropped her off outside the Payless store close to the mall. This is believed to have been the last time she was seen. Angela never turned up for her joint birthday party that evening. Angela's mother knew that her daughter frequently disappeared for a few days at a time, but she eventually always returned. When Angela's birthday passed and there was still no sign of her, her family reported her missing to the Tacoma Police Department. They too were wary of Angela's past behavior, but her mother convinced them that this time was different. She felt it in her gut. As reported by the Charlie Project, it would take 2 years for Angela to be listed as a missing person. Not much is known about the subsequent investigation, but at one time it was believed that she was another victim of the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. However, there's no concrete evidence to back up this theory. A local news reported that 6 months after Angela's disappearance, another 13-year-old went missing. This girl was found murdered 12 days later. Angela was known to hitchhike, and her mother believes that she may have hitchhiked on the day that she disappeared. Until Angela's body is found, it's almost impossible to speculate what happened. As the years have passed, Angela's case has grown colder and colder. Very few leads and tips come into the Tacoma Police Department, but they believe someone out there knows something. They told the media, quote, "If there are people who knew Angie that might have any information about what was going on in her life at the time, relationship she was in, if they have any information or even speculation about what happened to her, I'd be interested in hearing about it." If still alive today, Angela Mae Meeker would be 57 years old. Angela is described as a Caucasian female with blonde brown hair, hazel eyes, 5'1" to 5'2", and 100 to 109 pounds. She has a dark mole on her left side of her mouth, and she was last seen wearing black floral shirt, a blue and black satin jacket, blue jeans, sandals, and a black felt hat with red feathers. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Tacoma Police Department. Number 1. Anthony Merrill. 9-year-old Anthony Merrill was last seen at his home on Sells Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia on November 14, 1971. At the time, the area where Anthony lived, Harris Homes, was a housing project that housed hundreds of low-income families. It was a tight fit in the apartment for Anthony and his family. It had been reported that he shared a room with his 13-year-old brother, and the two had bunk beds. Also in the home were Anthony's mother and stepfather. On the evening of November 14th, Anthony climbed into the top bunk of his bed and drifted off to sleep. His 13-year-old brother took the bottom bunk, and the two were expecting a peaceful night's sleep. When Anthony's brother awoke the next morning, he was horrified to find his brother was missing. He immediately notified his mother, and they searched the entire apartment and the apartment complex. After calling around, they couldn't find anyone who had seen Anthony, and the Merrills went to the Atlanta Police Department. Unfortunately, the Atlanta PD classified Anthony's case as a runaway, even though he was just 9 years old. There was no sign of a struggle in his bedroom, and his older brother did not report hearing anything suspicious in the night. Anthony and his family originally hailed from North Carolina, and the Atlanta PD believed that the 9-year-old had somehow traveled back to North Carolina to be with relatives. His mother, of course, refuted this, but the police refused to listen. When the police failed to find any sign of Anthony in Georgia or North Carolina, they finally listed him as a missing person. Whilst Anthony's mother said that her son had no reason to run away from home, Anthony's brother told a different story. His brother claimed that their stepfather was violent and had even once stabbed their mother. Anthony's brother does not believe that he ran away from home and believes that his stepfather likely holds answers to what had happened to him. If Anthony was still alive, he would be 61 years old. At the time of his disappearance, he was described as a black male with black hair, black eyes, 5'2", and 95 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Atlanta Police Department. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more cold cases of Jane and John Does and the mysteries surrounding their deaths. Let's get into it. Number 4. Flagler County Doe. On January 10, 1993, 2 boys were playing on the Sea Ship Place in Palm Coast, Florida, on what was set to be another sunny day. Sea Ship Place is a cul-de-sac, and the road backs onto woodland and forest. Whilst the 2 boys were playing with their basketball, it rolled off into the woods, and the 2 boys ran to retrieve it. As they waved their hands through the brush, they discovered something much more terrifying than a ball. It was a human skull. The boys immediately ran home and told their parents about what they had discovered. The Flagler County Sheriff's Office quickly arrived at the scene and opened an investigation. As FCSO searched the scene, they found more partial skeletal remains in the woods. They also found remnants of clothing with a pocket lining, zipper, and faded tag. They also found size 7.5 tennis shoes that were also highly degraded. Only partial skeletal remains were discovered, and the area was declared a crime scene. The remains were sent to the University of Florida for further testing, which revealed that the PMI post-mortem index was around 2 years. In the report, they noted that the remains belonged to a female who was white or indigenous, aged 25 to 35, and approximately 5'3". Her remains showed a previous nasal fracture, although it is unknown whether this was connected to her death, and no cause of death could be determined. Teeth play a massive role in identifying the deceased, especially if the person has a unique dental profile. According to reports, most of Jane Doe's teeth had fallen out post-mortem, but they were still valuable to investigators. Her teeth showed signs of periodontal disease, which causes inflammation of the gums and the teeth. This indicated to investigators that she may not have been able to access adequate dental care. Unfortunately, her case had little public interest and it quickly went cold. It wasn't until 2021 that detectives with the Flagler County Sheriff's Office picked up her case again. This time, they had a new tool at their disposal: genetic genealogy. A sample of her DNA was sent off to Othram Labs, who assist law enforcement with DNA and genealogy in cases such as this. The results of the DNA analysis were quite shocking to investigators. Her DNA revealed that she was likely African American, possibly with Caucasian ancestors, and she was not white or indigenous as they had once thought. Investigators had spent years looking through missing persons cases, potentially looking at the wrong race. Othram stated that they also believed that she'd hailed from the Edgefield-Aiken in South Carolina. She was also listed as a possible descendant of George Washington Coleman and Clarissa Minnick. The FCSO and Othram Labs have contacted 30 relatives of the Flagler County Jane Doe, but so far there have been no identifications. In a bizarre twist, one of Jane Doe's relatives, Donya Williams, is also a genealogist. Investigators hope that with the advent of this new technology, they are one step closer to discovering her identity. A new facial approximation sketch was created and circulated around the U.S. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective Sarah Scalia of the Flagler County Sheriff's Office at 386-313-4911, quoting case number 93-008. Number 3. Finley Creek Jane Doe. On August 27, 1978, 2 hunters set out on an early morning expedition in the Finley Creek Crow Camp close to Elgin, Oregon. The 2 quietly walked through the trees and suddenly saw something in the distance. It was a skull sticking out of the ground. When they got closer, they discovered a shallow grave that contained human skull and other skeletal remains. The Oregon State Police were called to the scene, and what they uncovered shocked them to their core. Experts would later determine that the remains had been buried in about a 5-foot by 4-foot grave, and that the remains had been laid face down. Pathologist Dr. Judy Buczek completed the initial examination of the remains, determining that they belonged to a white or unknown race woman, aged 14 to 25, with light brown, sandy blonde hair, who was 5'1" to 5'4", weighing 114 to 140 pounds. At the scene, investigators had recovered a series of tiny bones. When the remains were sent to the Oregon Crime Lab for further analysis, scientists determined that the woman had been in her 6th to 8th month of pregnancy, and that these bones belonged to her unborn child. At the crime scene, investigators also found a nylon cord 4 feet long and a 2-foot long radio cord. There were also clothing items belonging to the woman, including a bra, red pants, lace-up shoes, and some red and white cloth and zippers. The post-mortem index believed that the woman has been deceased from anywhere from 2 to 3 years, with animal activity having compromised the integrity of the remains. The Oregon State Police have made several appeals to the public for information. In 1979, witnesses reported finding an abandoned camp close to where Finley Creek Jane Doe and her baby were found. More detailed descriptions of the camp are available online, but the critical pieces of evidence discovered were about 30 to 40 feminine pads, a blue windbreaker, a pair of boots that bore the name Fox, Holman, and Stepton. Over the years, several victims have been ruled out: Sherry Pickle, Dana Lou Sanchez, Melanie Flynn, Laura Flink, Rita Jolly, Laura Partridge, and Teresa Flitton. Dozens of loved ones have come forward with DNA samples and information, but so far no match has been found. Unfortunately, in 1990, the Union County District Attorney destroyed all the evidence in this case, including the remains, to be destroyed. The Finley Creek Jane Doe and her unborn child were cremated in Walla Walla. Since her cremation, nobody has been able to find her remains. No records were kept, investigators have lost track of them. Whilst authorities had little care or compassion for Finley Creek Jane Doe, it doesn't mean there aren't others who are willing to step up to the plate. Redgrave Research Forensic Services have created 2 approximate sketches from photographs of Jane Doe's skull. They are also in the process of extracting and sequencing DNA, the costs of which were covered by generous donations from the public. Redgrave is quietly working on this case in the background, but there have been no recent updates. It has been speculated that Finley Creek Jane Doe may have fallen victim to a serial killer, Gary Ridgway. Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, operated in Washington and Oregon, and the exact span of his crimes is unknown, and he may have been active as early as the 1970s, right up to 2001. According to the Doe Network, some have speculated that the Finley Creek Jane Doe is somehow connected to the Lewis-Clark Valley murders between 1979 and 1982 in Idaho and Washington. The timelines and the locations don't quite match up, but as a suspect has never been apprehended in the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, it's hard to say. In 2022, Suzanne Timms came forward to Redgrave and the OCP stating that she believes Finley Creek Jane Doe is her mother, Patty Otto, who disappeared on August 31, 1976. Autopsy records do not match that of Finley Creek Jane Doe. Still, Suzanne told the Landgrove Observer, quote, "The discrepancy is due to an error made by the OCP's medical examiner whilst doing examinations of the skeletal remains of 2 Jane Does in his office at about the same time in 1978. She later stated that the dental records from the report of the second Jane Doe matched her mother. So far, no confirmation has been made, and the case of the Finley Creek Jane Doe remains unsolved. Anyone with information is asked to contact Dr. Veronica Nichivane of the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office at 971-673-8300, voting case number 78-1865. Number 2. Benton County Jane Doe. October 8, 1976 started like any other day for Norman Skog, a farmer in the small town of Otterbein, Indiana. As the afternoon wore on, Norman slowly began to finish work for the day when he encountered something bizarre in one of his many fields, just off County Road 200. It was a white box, only this box wasn't a small discarded piece of rubbish. When he tried to lift it out of his field that he could plow, he noticed that it was unusually heavy and called for help. Norman then loaded the box into the truck and took it to his home a few miles away. The Skog family crowded around the box to see what treasures lay inside, but instead of golden riches, they were hit with a pungent smell, the familiar stench of decay. The box also emitted a strong, flowery, perfumey smell, almost as someone had tried to cover the stench. Norman began cutting through the layers of tape, plastic, and rope, and discovered a broken perfume bottle. When they got past a few layers, they collectively recoiled in horror. Inside the 3-foot-long, 2-foot-wide, and 1-foot-tall box lay the remains of a woman. The Indiana State Police and the Benton County Sheriff's Office were called to the scene shortly after. The Indiana State Police began slicing through more layers of tape and plastic. They found that the human remains inside were that of a woman tied in the fetal position. During the autopsy, it was determined that she was Caucasian, 55 to 65 years old, with light brown graying hair, around 5'1" and 160 pounds. And her cause of death was a gunshot wound to the skull. It was discovered that the woman, who would become known as the Benton County Jane Doe, or the Box Lady of Benton County, had undergone a right radical mastectomy, likely as a result of cancer. This procedure had produced a scar that ran from her belly button to her sternum and multiple other scars on her right breast. She had been fully dressed at the time of her discovery. and she was found in a green double-knit pantsuit, green slacks, a beige slip, and a beige girdle. There is a multitude of bizarre clues and red herrings in this case, the first being the box. According to the Doe Network, the white box she was found in was manufactured by a company in Melrose Park, Illinois, by May through October of 1976. The box had only been distributed to Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and was mainly used to move furniture. There was also another bizarre clue when it came to the box. Norman Skog had described the weather that October afternoon as drizzly and dreary. The rain had been pouring since early morning on October 8th, but the box had been bone dry when it was found. The pathologist determined that she'd been dead for at least 1 to 2 weeks. So where had she been stored? How did she get there? Perhaps the most bizarre part of the case is figuring out how she got there in the first place. Norman didn't report seeing any tire tracks when he discovered the box. So how did someone get in and out of his fields undetected? Otterbein is a very isolated community made up primarily of farmers. The small town gets few visitors during the day when the farmers are hard at work because the roads are quiet. But investigators don't believe that the Benton County Jane Doe arrived by car. They believe she arrived by helicopter. Other farmers in the area reported seeing a helicopter flying overhead but thought nothing of it. If a helicopter had been used, it would explain why there were no tire tracks or footprints. The question is, who could afford a private helicopter used to dump a body? This theory opens a larger can of worms, and the speculation runs rife from here on out. Some have suggested that the woman's calloused hands indicate that she may have worked as a cleaner or a maid. One theory is that the Benton County Jane Doe worked for someone very important or someone conducting clandestine business. Either way, this theory goes that Jane Doe overheard something she shouldn't have and was taken care of before she could snitch. In 2019, the Benton County Jane Doe's body was exhumed so a fresh DNA sample could be obtained. In 2021, the Jane Doe Project teamed up with the Benton County Sheriff's Office to assist them in their identification. So far, no matches have been made, and the DNA Doe Project continues its work. A new burial was crowdfunded for Benton County Jane Doe, replacing her cheap coffin and headstone with something more fitting. Investigators know that someone out there holds the key to this mystery. It's just a matter of getting them to talk. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Benton County Coroner's Office at 765-418-2295, quoting case number 2019 Benton 001. Number 1. Baby Jane Doe, 1988. On December 21, 1988, 2 road workers got the shock of their lives as they were working off of Duncan Road in Ware County, Georgia. They were clearing out an illegal dump site just off the road. The workers found a TV cabinet that gave them an uneasy feeling. When they opened the cabinet up, they found concrete and a suitcase. Inside the suitcase lay a duffel bag. Neither man dared to look any further and immediately called the police. The discovery shook the workers, and things were only about to get worse. After cordoning off the scene, investigators carefully opened the duffel bag and found a brown blanket with something poking out underneath. After carefully lifting the blankets so as to not disturb evidence, they came across the body of a little girl. Investigators were left traumatized by their discovery, and her body was transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. The medical examiner stated that the girl was black, aged 3 to 4 years old, with black hair pulled into a ponytail, and stood around 2'9" and 25 pounds. Her ears had been pierced, but no earrings were present, and she'd been dressed in white pajama top with red-pink pony symbol, white thermal pajama pants with maroon trim, and she was wearing a disposable diaper. Her post-mortem index had listed anywhere between 1 to 3 months, and the medical examiner had been unable to determine a cause of death. Little information is available about baby Jane Doe. She has also received little media attention. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations, along with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, are involved in baby Jane Doe's case, and they have recently obtained a DNA sample for further analysis. According to the JBI, they have searched as far as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina in a bid to identify this child. JBI agent Jason Sechrist told News 4 Jax that the recent identification of the boy in the box, Joseph Zarelli, has given them hope that this case will eventually be solved. The JBI is currently conducting its own genealogical research, which they hope will create a family tree of baby Jane Doe. From there, they hope to eliminate people one by one until they hopefully reach her parents. Agent Seacrest went on to say, quote, "I truly believe that somebody remembers a little girl, and that little girl went away, and most likely they were given a story that they went to live with a family member, or that they went on to live a better life, and nobody ever saw or heard from that little girl ever again." JBI is offering a $5,000 reward for any information that leads to her identification. If you have any information, you're asked to call Special Agent Dale Wiley of the JBI at 912-389-4103 or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-843-5678. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today, we're discussing 3 more cold cases of Jane and John Does recently identified and the mysteries surrounding their deaths. Let's get into it. Number 3. Patricia Greenwood. March 30th, 1980 marked a dark day in the history books of Lake Erie, Ohio. That morning, the Sandusky police responded to a call about a bizarre object floating at the lake's edge. As they approached Cedar Point, officers realized the gravity of the situation. Backup was requested, and the area was cordoned off from nosy residents. Unfortunately, there's limited information about the discovery. According to the Detroit Free Press, the Sandusky Police Department found the body of a young woman. She was aged 20 to 30, she was 5'5" and 120 pounds, wearing what they described as a disco-style dress slumped at the edge of Lake Erie. The discovery rocked the community, and investigators immediately set about identifying their victim. Unfortunately, this initial piece of the investigation would never come to be. The Sandusky police did not release the woman's manner of death, which remains a point of contention. An autopsy revealed that the woman had several broken bones. Her femur, pelvis, and jaw were all shattered. However, the medical examiner couldn't be sure if the injuries had happened pre- or post-mortem. Several press releases and conferences were held, but nobody recognized the young woman in the size 12 disco dress. The case immediately went stale. There were no scars, jewelry pieces, or other identifying features on her body. In time, the woman was buried as the Erie County Jane Doe. There was no date of birth to adorn her grave, just March 30th, 1980. The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on the Erie County Jane Doe, but with limited evidence and resources, the case could not progress. It would take decades for the name Erie County Jane Doe to appear in the media again, but there was good news this time. In late 2021, the Porchlight Project, a nonprofit organization that helps to fund the solving of cold cases, announced that they would be willing to pay for the new DNA testing in the Erie County Jane Doe case. By 2021, genetic genealogy was beginning to peak, and the Sandusky Police Department believed this may be their only chance to close this case once and for all. Shortly after accepting the donation, the woman's remains were sent to Bode Technology in Virginia for further DNA analysis. Unfortunately, this kind of testing isn't instantaneous. Technicians worked exceedingly hard to research, prepare, and test samples for years. Almost 2 years later, in March 2023, the Sandusky Police Department and the Porchlight Project announced that the Erie County Jane Doe had been identified as 31-year-old Patricia Eleanor Greenwood. The announcement came on March 30th, 43 years to the day since she was discovered. Analysis found Patricia after discovering that she was one of 12 children who had been given up for adoption. Patricia was born in 1948 in Michigan and has lived in Traverse City, Bay City, and Saginaw. Patricia was never reported missing, and her siblings last saw her in 1979. The Sandusky Police Department is still working on Patricia's cold case, and while she has been identified, it's anything but closed. According to Patricia's sister, she may have been a sex worker at the time of her death, and the Sandusky Police Department believe that Patricia met with foul play. Unfortunately, no one in her family had a photograph of Patricia, and law enforcement is hoping to find anyone who knew her to come forward, as they'd like to get a better picture of what her life was like. Hopefully, with that information, they can be one step closer to finding her killer. Nick Edwards, a board member for Project Porchlight, gave this statement to the media regarding Patricia's case, quote, "Being able to give Patricia Greenwood her name back is the first step in finding the justice that she deserves. Thank you to the brilliant folks at Bode for the wonderful work that they do. Bode continues to impress, and their assistance to those in law enforcement is making it more difficult for bad people to get away with bad things. The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on this victim, even after all these years. Now it's time for the public to come together and provide information about Patricia Greenwood to the detectives. Patricia needs your help." The investigation into Patricia's murder continues, and if you have any information, you're asked to contact the Sandusky Police Department at 419-627-5980.
Police have turned the page in case number 9379, but there are still more questions.
At this point, we don't know where she went missing from. We're hoping that someone may see this and have known Patricia or her family. And hopefully from there, we can kind of retrace backwards the steps of her life.
Old-fashioned police work coupled with new technology helping to bring answers to families.
There's still a lot of people that are buried under John Doe and Jane Doe that are in plots all over Northeast Ohio. That still, their voices have never been heard.
Number 2. Claudette Jean Zabolski Powers. It was on February 16, 1986, when hikers along the Pacific Crest Trail made a grisly discovery at the Los Coyotes Indian Reservation. The partially decomposed body of a woman lay at the edge of the campsite. San Diego County Sheriff's Office was immediately dispatched to the scene and began their investigation. Moments later, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office received a call that would change everything. 14 miles from where the female victim was, there was found a man in a similar condition. Both victims were wearing thick jackets and layers of clothing. The similarities were too apparent to ignore, and investigators knew they had to identify both bodies before their killer could be identified. Law enforcement has withheld a lot of information in both of these cases. The manner of death of the man, found 14 miles away, has never been released to preserve the investigation's integrity. Detectives struggled to make any headway in either case. There was very little evidence, and the evidence the SDCSO did have was being withheld from the media. Her murder floated through the media for a few weeks before interest fizzled out. For decades, her case would go untouched, but the San Diego County Sheriff's Office knew there was family out there looking for their loved one. In 2023, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office turned to genetic genealogy. A sample of the woman's hair was submitted for analysis on websites such as 23andMe and GEDmatch. According to CBS, quote, "Using this DNA analysis, as well as census records and other public information, detectives were able to build family trees and track down relatives." Investigators had now identified the family tree, and all they had to do was find the missing link. Shortly after her DNA was submitted, law enforcement identified the Jane Doe as Claudette Jean Zabolski Powers. The mother of two would have been 24 years old when she was brutally murdered. Detectives pieced together what they knew of her life before she disappeared. In the early 1980s, Claudette left her Michigan home and moved to Washington with her husband. By 1983, Claudette filed for divorce and found a property in San Diego County for herself and her daughters. However, in 1984, tragedy struck the Powers family when their patriarch passed away. Upon losing her father, Claudette felt lost. Her siblings recalled to officers that September 1984 was the last time they saw or spoke to their beloved sister at their father's funeral. After that, she dropped off the map. Claudette's family said that they never gave up looking for her. Her siblings hired a private investigator, but there is no sign. Her siblings and family loved Claudette, and they knew her disappearance was out of the ordinary. However, she was never reported missing formally, and her family had no idea that she'd been deceased all these years. Whilst Claudette has now been identified, investigators still have a long way to go in this investigation. They are now tasked with piecing Claudette's life together from September 1984 to 1986. There are some reports that she worked as a waitress in Escondido, and anyone with information or may have known Claudette is asked to come forward. Her sister said in a statement to the media, quote, "It's been really hard on her family. Someone knows what happened. A neighbor, anyone that knew her knows what happened. If you're still alive and you knew my sister and you knew what happened to her, please come forward. Please, we need closure." San Diego County Sheriff's Office has not released the manners of the death for Claudette or the John Doe, and the investigation is ongoing. What they have said is that they are looking for a male suspect and that Claudette had suffered a violent death. They are hoping to identify the man who had been murdered as well. They said that the man is a similar age to Claudette, mid-20s, and that they were both similarly dressed in thermals and clothing suitable for camping. They had both been deceased for approximately 2 weeks before their bodies were discovered. No other personal effects were found, and no camping gear, bags, or purses. The area was remote, and they would have needed a vehicle to get there. At this time, there are no sketches of John Doe available, nor much information that might help identify him.
DNA matched with her youngest sister, Laura Fries, who all these years wondered about her sister.
Claudette was a very loving and caring mom. She loved her kids very much. She loved her family very much. My mom can pass on now when it comes time, knowing that her oldest child has been found.
Anyone with information is asked to contact the Sheriff's Homicide Unit at 858-285-6330. There's a $1,000 reward for any information that leads to an arrest. Number 1. Douglas Lynn Streeter. On October 26, 1976, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department were called to the Talisman Sugar Farm in Palm Beach County, Florida. This case would be like no other, sending investigators on an ever-twisting turning path. In the cane field lay the body of a man, who was later believed to be white or Native American. His remains were somewhat skeletonized, and that he had been exposed to the elements for at least 2 months before his discovery. Forensic experts deemed his death a homicide, with the gunshot wound to the back of his skull as the cause of death. He had a unique Timex watch with the initials LJ carved on the inside. Investigators also discovered that Palm Beach County John Doe had been shot 3 times overall. Over the years, several forensic photography experts have created several renditions of what he may have looked like in life, but these failed to produce any leads. In 2022, Othram, the nonprofit organization, joined forces with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Their press release from Othram states, quote, "This case was entered into NamUs as UP1300. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office sent skeletal remains for the unidentified homicide victim to Othram. After many months of hard work, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office announced that the 1976 Palm Beach John Doe has been identified as 29-year-old Douglas Lynn Streeter." In April 1976, Douglas and a group of friends traveled from his hometown of Bryan, Ohio to Florida on a boys' trip in March 1976. According to Douglas's friends, he was last seen in the vicinity of the Spanish Oaks Apartments in Boca Raton, Florida, in April 1976. He went by the nickname Strut. From Florida, it seems he became separated from his friends and disappeared. His friends returned home without him. His estimated time of death was around August, but he disappeared in April. No one knows what he'd been doing in the months between his disappearance and murder. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective John Cogburn of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office at 561-688-4063. There's a $3,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. And today we're going to be discussing 4 more decades-old cold cases that have recently been solved and closed, answering questions that families have been asking for years, and in some cases, serving long-awaited justice. But before we start, just a quick reminder that helps to keep the lights on is that if you enjoyed the content and want to support the channel, the easiest way is to throw the video a like, share it with friends, and share your thoughts down below in the comment section. It helps to grow the channel and is always appreciated. But with that being said, let's get into it. Case number 4, Joyce Casper.
In 1987, the city of Boise was shook by the murder of 65-year-old Joyce Casper. She was found strangled to death inside her car a few blocks away from the store that she owned on Vista Avenue. That murder went unsolved for 36 years. Until this week. On Friday, Boise police announced that they had solved the case. And earlier today, police detectives and Casper's family gathered at City Hall where they finally got some closure. And News Channel 7's Jude Binkley was there. Jude, quite a day for the family there.
Absolutely, Joe. It's been a very long time coming, but detectives said they were confident this day would come as they finally were able to close the book on this 36-year-old murder.
A mother.
She was just really generous of spirit.
A murder.
It impacted this community in a massive way.
And 36 years later, a mystery uncovered.
We solved it. This case is now closed.
A case that stayed with Lance Anderson.
I was the first detective from the Violent Crimes Unit that made it to the scene.
It was on October 13, 1987 in Boise, Idaho, when Joyce Casper was found in her car just a few blocks from her business, Casper's Vista Hallmark and Gift Shop. She had been murdered, and her death would shake the community. Joyce was 65 years old when she died. Joyce was well known in the community to be kind and caring. She and her husband, who was a pharmacist, owned a pharmacy until 1986, until they opened Casper's Vista Hallmark and Gift Shop. Her husband, John Casper, had died in 1982, and Joyce continued to run the shop after his death. John and Joyce had 3 children together, 2 daughters and 1 son. Joyce was known to work late, and it wasn't odd for her to be at the shop until very late in the evening. So she could have been attacked any time between the evening of October 12th and the early morning of October 13th. Authorities would eventually release that they believed Joyce had been abducted from her shop, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death before being put in her car and driven away. Another significant piece of evidence was that Joyce had reported being attacked in her shop 2 weeks prior to her murder. But she had managed to scare him off, and the attacker had run away quickly. During the encounter, he had attempted to assault her. She reported that the man was in his late teens, early 20s, with slicked back black hair. Police never found this man, nor the man who had killed Joyce. The case would go cold very quickly, with no witnesses and very little evidence that could be used in 1987, and all the leads soon dried up. But in 1988, another attack similar to Joyce's reopened the case. Another woman in her 60s had been attacked, but in her case, her attacker was found quickly and denied having any involvement with Joyce's case, even though there were several similarities. The case would again turn cold, and it would stay that way for decades. It was reopened in 2005 when they took another look at the evidence that had been preserved in 1987. However, at that time, nothing new came up. But in 2017, 2 detectives were assigned permanently to the case, and scientific advancements had caught up with DNA analysis. They sent a DNA sample believed to have been from the suspect to Parabon Nanolabs, and they were able to create a computer-generated profile of the potential suspect. They would release that they believed the suspect was Latin American, possibly from Puerto Rico or Colombia. The data from the genetic markers would reveal that he had brown or hazel eyes, brown or black hair, and that he didn't have freckles. In 2017, they would admit that some of this, like the hair, may have changed in the 30 years since the murder, but that they had hoped someone would recognize the composite image created by their program. In 2019, a new detective would start to work the case, this time working with Identifinders International in the hopes of using genetic genealogy to help find a suspect. This analysis would take until 2023 to reveal the suspect. And it was in July 2023 when the Boise Police Department announced they had found a suspect in the 36-year-old cold case, Frank A. Rodriguez. Unfortunately, no arrest could be made as Rodriguez had died in 2007 by suicide. Authorities met with his family, taking DNA swabs, which were analyzed and proved through genetics that Rodriguez was the suspect. Even though he had passed, both the retired Boise detectives that had worked the case and the Casper family were relieved to have some answers about what had happened to Joyce after all this time. Rodriguez had a history of violent outbursts, mental health issues, and substance abuse, but he didn't have a criminal record. At the time of Joyce's murder, he would have only been 17 years old, and he lived only blocks away from the store. He spent the rest of his life living in the area and is being investigated in connection to other cold cases in Idaho. Rodriguez's physical description at the time also matched the report Joyce gave from the attempted assault that had taken place at her store 2 weeks prior to her murder. Police have asked if anyone knows anything about Frank A. Rodriguez to contact the Boise police, as they believe this is probably not his only crime. Case number 3, Jewel Parchman Langford. It was on May 3, 1975, when a farmer was checking the back end of his property near the Nation River, about 40 kilometers east of Ottawa, Canada. He noticed something floating in the river, and there he found a woman's body, face down, in the water. Before doing anything, he called the police. The Ottawa Police Department arrived and discovered a woman's bloated, naked body with a cloth covering her face. She had a dark blue leotard top bunched up around her neck. Her hands had been bound in front of her with a blue necktie with Canadian flags, and her ankles had also been bound with 2 additional men's ties. The cloth around her head was described as 2 pieces of a bloody green fabric, a disposable hand towel, and a distinctive Irish linen tea towel. Loosely wrapped around her neck was a television cable, and a piece of a curtain rod runner could be found in her armpit. The autopsy would put her age between 25 and 35. She had shoulder-length dyed red hair that was believed to have been brown naturally, with hazel or blue eyes, believed to be about 100 pounds, and she was 5'5" tall. Both her fingers and toenails were painted red. She had a high-quality partial dentures with multiple fillings, having police believe that she was of a middle-class background. They stated that it appeared she'd never had children, and she'd had her appendix removed. She'd also eaten a large meal right before her death. Her larynx had been fractured, and her case was ruled a homicide. Due to the nature of the body's decomposition, they couldn't determine if she'd been sexually assaulted. Her body was believed to have been in the river for about 1 to 4 weeks, putting her time of death between April 5th and April 26th. Police believe she'd been dumped in the river from a nearby bridge. When they investigated, they found blood on the bridge. It wasn't enough to get a blood type at that time, but they assumed it was from the woman. There had been heavy rain on April 19th, so that led authorities to believe she'd been dumped between the 19th and the 26th. All of this information, and police had one key piece missing. They couldn't identify the woman. They combed hundreds of missing persons reports. They contacted dentists locally, as the Jane Doe had a custom denture made for her, and several fillings. Their forensic dental imprints were published in dental journals in North America and overseas, but no one recognized them. Law enforcement knocked on doors in a 25-kilometer radius of the bridge. They tracked down where the TV cable had been sold and checked hotels and motels where it might have been installed, but nothing. The necktie that had bound her had been made in Montreal and sold all over Ontario and Quebec. The tea towel from Ireland was imported by a Toronto company and sold in mass quantities until 1972. Nothing seemed to spark any leads. Without knowing who the woman was, the police had very little to go on. Was she from Canada? Was she a visitor? Had she recently moved here? Had she come from Montreal, or was just dumped near Ottawa, which, at the time, was a technique often used by criminals to confuse detectives? She would be dubbed the Nation River Lady, and she'd stay in a Toronto morgue until 1987, 12 years after the discovery. She was eventually buried in Toronto Mount Pleasant Cemetery. News of her burial would bring in some fresh tips, but would lead to dead ends. The Nation River Lady would be in the news every few years, with new sketches and advancements, but still they couldn't identify the woman. It wasn't until 2023 when Canadian officials would announce that they not only had identified the Nation River Lady, but had a suspect in custody. The Nation River Lady was identified as Jewel Parchman Langford, who was 48 when she died and had traveled from her hometown in Tennessee and moved to Montreal in April 1975. She was a successful businesswoman who owned a spa with her ex-husband, and she'd been well missed by her family, who'd reported her missing shortly after not hearing from her in 1975. Her parents and siblings had all passed by the time she was identified, but she still had some nieces who helped identify her after all these years. Jewel was identified after her body was exhumed in 2019 for a new DNA profile, which the Canadian authorities shared with US-based DNA Doe Project. Using genetic genealogy, they could upload the results into the database shared with the police. Quickly, they found a match and had new samples taken from living relatives, which Canadian labs confirmed. They'd been able to make the announcement privately with the family in 2020 that they had identified Jewel. This was kept out of the press in the hopes of finding more information about her killer. The suspect was also identified via genetic genealogy. Florida native Rodney Nichols is now 81 years old and was living in Montreal and worked as a professional rugby player at the time of the murder. It would come out that Nichols had been dating Jewel at the time. It is being reported that once he was arrested, he confessed to the murder, but this is now being called into question by his lawyer. In the confession, he said that he killed her because she had lied about her age, being 48 when he was only 32. Nichols had previously been investigated in connection to her disappearance, but he claimed to have lied to law enforcement when Jewel had been reported missing, saying he had heard from her and she was well and in Vancouver. Nichols is not being investigated for any other cold cases at this time. The Ottawa government is now working on extraditing Nichols to Canada, hoping he will face charges in Ottawa. This case is still ongoing, and Nichols has not been convicted at this time. Jewel's family is glad to have answers, and in 2022, they had a small ceremony after her body had been sent back to Tennessee, where her grave marker was changed from missing to finally home and at peace. Number 2. Cornelia Humpher. It was on April 20th, 1978, when a woman named Cornelia Humpher was murdered in Germany when she was 18. She was found the day after the murder with her body dumped on the roadside with 14 stab wounds in her neck and back. Witness came forward early on in the investigation, saying that they saw a small car with a green license plate in the area. The American military stationed in Germany often used the green license plate. It was discovered that Cornelia had been having an extramarital affair with a man named Tommy Molina. He was 24 at the time. He was stationed in Germany with his first wife, and he owned a Fiat 124, which matched the description of the car seen leaving Cornelia's body. He was interviewed 5 days after Cornelia was discovered, but he said he'd been home with his wife that day. However, she couldn't remember. The German authorities and the American military didn't have much, and he was not charged at that time. He would be interviewed again, but not until 1996, after his now third wife reported to military officials that while intoxicated in 1995, he confessed multiple times to her that he had killed a woman in Germany with a knife. He told her he was having an affair and that she'd gotten pregnant and had threatened to tell his wife. Again, he was questioned in 1996, and he strongly denied any involvement, and the investigation moved slowly again after that. But later, with advancements in DNA technology, the investigators reopened the case. In 2019, the German government requested a new blood sample taken from Cornelia's body. A federal warrant was issued, and in 2020, they collected fresh DNA, and in 2021, they confirmed the match of DNA that was collected off Cornelia's clothing to Tommy Molina. Tommy Molina is now 69 years old. He was arrested on June 21, 2023, and charged with the murder of Cornelia Humpher. He is currently awaiting extradition to Germany, where he could face 15 years in prison if convicted. Case number 1. Herbert Boone. It was on April 16, 1991 at approximately 3 a.m. when Toronto police officers responded to a 911 call at 149 Dundas Street East, just west of Jarvis Street in Toronto, Canada. Officers would find a man suffering from multiple stab wounds. The victim soon died at the scene. He would later be identified as Herbert Boone, a 43-year-old Toronto resident originally from Newfoundland. Herbert didn't live in the apartment he was found. It was known to be a short-term or low-rent apartment. Police would find evidence that the killer had washed out the blood in the bathroom and the killer had thrown his blood-soaked clothes in a nearby dumpster. His murder case would quickly go cold. Toronto police couldn't connect anyone to the crime. However, in June 2023, Toronto police announced that they had positively identified the killer. They identified Kevin Welsh, who they stated they'd used DNA testing on preserved evidence to determine the Toronto resident was the killer. Welsh was 46 years old at the time of the killing, and it's not known what sparked the altercation. Fortunately, Kevin Welsh died in 2007. Authorities said that if he were alive today, he could be charged with 1 count of second-degree murder. Police have not released what DNA technology was used to identify Walsh, but they did release that it was Walsh who was staying in the apartment where Boone had been found in 1991. However, authorities are still asking anyone with information about the murder to contact Toronto Police at 416-808-7400 or Crime Stoppers anonymously at 416-222-8477. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more cold cases where Jane or John Doe has recently been identified. Let's get into it. These cases are particularly heartbreaking because for years, without an identification, these families never knew what had happened to their loved ones. Without their names, their murder investigations have been deeply hindered, and now that they have their names back, their families have answers, and their investigations have a much better chance of being solved. Number 1. Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. On June 3, 1993, a woman's body was found on the side of the westbound Pacheco Pass Highway near Gilroy, California, by a truck driver who had stopped to take a break. She had been wearing blue jeans, a blue t-shirt, and a blue jacket. She was severely decomposed at the time of the discovery. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department did an autopsy at the time, which put the cause of death as undetermined. They could not identify the victim at the time, and she was given the name Blue Pacheco Jane Doe for what she was wearing and where she was found. This Jane Doe would get justice before we would ever know her name. A serial killer, Keith Hunter Jesperson, or known as the Happy Face Killer, sent a letter to the Santa Clara County District Attorney in 1997 describing how he dumped a woman on the side of the road on Route 152. But it would not be until 2006 that he would be charged with the death of the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. There's not much information as to why it took so long, but he confessed in court in 2007 and her death was added to his life sentence. Keith Hunter Jesperson is a Canadian-American serial killer who killed at least 8 women in the early 90s. He is nicknamed the Happy Face Killer for how he signed letters to newspapers before he was arrested. If you want me to cover Jesperson, please comment below. In 2019, the Sheriff's Department ramped up its efforts to identify Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. They used genetic genealogy and the DNA Doe Project's help to find a relative of the Jane Doe. They got hits all over North America. They contacted authorities all over the US and Canada to connect with potential family members in the hopes of finally identifying her. In 2021, they found a likely candidate, and by April 2022, Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office announced they had successfully identified the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe as Patricia Patsy Skipple. Patsy was a mother and would have been 45 years old at the time of her death. She had gone missing from Molalla, Oregon in 1992 when she left her home one morning and never returned. In a press release, the sheriff's office stated, quote, "Although this criminal case was adjudicated, detectives never gave up as they worked diligently throughout this investigation to provide closure to the family of Patricia Skipple." The sheriff's office also thanked the DNA Doe Project, Oregon State Police Criminal Investigation Division, including Detective Jim O'Connor, and the Calgary Police Service, including Detective Ken Carrier and analyst Amy Lameau, for their help throughout this investigation. Number 2. Jane Doe, 1985. On December 16, 1985, 2 hunters found human remains in a field 50 yards off the junction of County Road 50 and County Road 90 in Pearlsland, Texas. The remains were discovered to be female, believed at the time to be Hispanic, and they determined the death occurred 6 to 12 months before the remains were discovered. There was never much released about the death, but it had been ruled a homicide and the female victim was never identified. The Doe Network reports the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. On October 6th, the Brazoria County Sheriff's Office got a DNA report that stated they had found the match for the 1985 Jane Doe. She was identified as missing teen Alicia Lisa Marie Cooks. Alicia had been reported missing by her family in Houston, Texas in the summer of 1985. This would put her time of death closer to 6 months when her remains were found. The Cooks family had come forward recently and given samples of DNA that were uploaded to NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, in hopes of finding any information about where she might be, and this is how they managed to identify Alicia Cooks. Her brother Byron Parker is pictured with the police and Brazoria County Sheriff's Office press release announcing the identification of Alicia Cooks. In this press release, a letter stated, quote, "The family was given some closure as Alicia was identified and found after 36 years. Her murder investigation remains open and they are still looking for anyone with information on this case. You're asked to contact the Brazoria County Sheriff's Office or call the Brazoria County Crime Stoppers." Number 3. Boy in a Box. It was on February 25, 1957 that would start the oldest homicide cold case worked by the Philadelphia Police Department. A college student was out in the woods in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when he stumbled upon a cardboard box. Inside the box was what he believed was a doll, but upon further inspection, he realized it was the body of a small child. The little boy had been severely beaten and malnourished. His blonde hair had been cut in a haphazard manner, and his fingernails were trimmed short. He was unclothed but wrapped in a small plaid blanket. His age was estimated to be between 4 and 6. Experts felt he'd only been deceased for a few days, and detectives felt it would be a quick case to solve. Little evidence was found near the crime scene. The box itself had likely been picked up from the area. There had been a cap found nearby, but there was little to identify the wearer. Despite national coverage of the case, no one came forward to identify the little boy. He was given the moniker Boy in a Box, but was later given the kinder name of America's Unknown Child. For decades, his cold case was reopened, closed, evidence retested, closed. Detectives who had worked the original case retired, and the case was passed down to multiple generations of detectives. For over 6 decades, this went on. And as time went on, few believed there would ever be answers. In 2019, Philly PD petitioned the courts asking for permission to exhume his body and use genetic genealogy to attempt to identify him. That petition was approved, and DNA was retrieved from his remains. Since then, genealogists have been working to reverse engineer his family tree, and on December 8, 2022, detectives made an announcement. America's Unknown Child had his name returned, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Joseph was nearly 4 years old when he died. Joseph has multiple living siblings. His parents are deceased. Law enforcement is not releasing information about his parents in order to protect the privacy of the living siblings, but has stated that his parents were prominently known in Delaware. He had never been reported missing. The investigation for Joseph's murder remains ongoing. Philadelphia PD Captain Jason Smith said in a statement to the media, quote, "We may not make an arrest, we may never make an identification, but we're going to do our darndest to try. There remains a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest."
The unveiling of 2 headstones with the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli closes one chapter of arguably Philadelphia's most notorious cold case.
We've grown up knowing about the boy.
Patty Braxton and Kimberly Augustine's father was a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department. Thomas Augustine kept this case in the spotlight for years.
It's just bittersweet. As my dad passed 6 weeks before they identified the boy, and this would mean the world to him.
It was devastating to us to find that, 6 weeks after he passed, he got a name, but we're grateful for that.
Joseph Zarelli's identity was revealed last month at a news conference. The boy lived his short life in the area of 63rd and Callow Hill Streets in West Philadelphia. His body was discovered in February 1957, discarded in a box in Fox Chase. He had been beaten and was malnourished. Investigators have since declined to say what they believe happened. Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society made a point to speak directly to surviving family members of Joseph Zarelli.
I want to thank the families, the surviving siblings and relatives of Joseph, who may not have known anything about this, who care and keep him in his prayers.
Some members of Joseph's family attended the service and spoke at length with reporters off camera, telling us they mourned for Joseph, but say they never knew anything about the investigation or even the case before last month's news conference. They told me they'll be persistent in keeping in contact with police so that perhaps they can someday have closure and know what happened.
Number 4. Patricia Gildowie. On September 27, 2001, construction workers in Fairfax, Virginia, discovered the skeletal remains near a drainage ditch. The remains were collected along with clothing and jewelry. The victim was roughly estimated to have been deceased for a long time, around 20 years, and the forensic examiner that looked over the remains said that the victim was an African-American woman who was 15 to 20 years old. Her cause of death was deemed a homicide, with a gunshot wound found to the back of the skull. Law enforcement had worked to identify the woman, but based on the description of the victim, nothing came up that led to a positive identification. Once all the investigative leads dried up, the case went cold. In early 2022, Fairfax County Police Department reopened the investigation and paired up with Orthram Labs to examine the DNA for fresh clues. Based on the DNA, they discovered the victim was Caucasian, and the DNA connected to a half-sister who had supplied her DNA years prior in hopes of finding answers for her missing sister. After 47 years, Patricia Agnes Gildowie's murder was one step closer to solving. Patricia went missing in 1975 and was 17 when she went missing. Her family, originally from France, came to the U.S. in 1958. The family had moved to Fairfax, Virginia in the early 70s. Her sister, Veronique Duperly, told law enforcement more about her sister. When she last saw Patricia on February 8, 1975, she'd been covered in bruises. Patricia was dating a man who was in his 30s, who Veronique had always believed had something to do with Patricia's death. She described Patricia as a free spirit who, as a teenager, didn't really want to live by anyone's rules. She said Patricia was sweet and would never hurt anyone, but had recently gotten involved with a rougher group of friends. Law enforcement has not released the name of Patricia's boyfriend, but has stated they will be looking to speak with him in regard to their relationship and her disappearance. They now believe that Patricia had been murdered close to the day that she had been reported missing by her family. Her murder investigation remains ongoing.
When I gave them my DNA, they sent it to the lab while they were sitting here in my living room, and they had 100% DNA match within 15 minutes.
Veronique Duperly describes the moment last month when Fairfax County detectives told her new DNA technology from a company called Orthram had linked her Ancestry.com results to the unidentified woman. 1975 came flooding back. Shuby, the nickname everyone used for her younger sister Patricia Gildowie, had been found. Veronique says Shuby was dating an older man who loaned her a car, a white Cadillac Eldorado with red interior, similar to this one, that her younger sister was driving the last time she saw her. That was also the day she noticed the bruises.
Bruises on her upper arms, her shoulders, and the back of her legs, and I said, well, why are you so black and blue, and she said, well, I fall a lot. And I said, no, you don't.
Fairfax County police say they are anxious to talk to Shuby's boyfriend. They don't know his name, only that he was in his 30s at the time and worked at a now closed upholstery store near Church Street and Lawyers Road in Vienna.
We're moving fast and furious on this case. We know the killer is still out there.
Police believe that there are still people alive, people who may be living in this area who have information about the murder of Shuby Gildowie. In McLean, Jackie Benson, News 4.
Case number 4, Althea Dale Blankenship. It was in 1973 when 23-year-old Althea Dale Blankenship and her 4-year-old son Jeffrey moved to Port Townsend, close to the Puget Sound in Washington. Althea had spent her early life in Virginia before moving to Washington with her family. She graduated from Shoreline High School, Washington, in 1967, and 2 years later, her son Jeffrey was born. Althea had set her sights on creating a better life for the pair. Contemporary news articles do not mention whether Jeffrey's father was in the picture, and it appears he has never been named publicly. After spending a few years in Shoreline, Althea decided to move 50 miles to Port Townsend, Washington. Althea's parents, Oscar and Mary Marks, owned a home in Port Townsend, and she wanted herself and her son to be closer to her parents. The move was a breath of fresh air for the two, and they rented a room from Glenn Allen Bagley. According to local news reports, Althea and Glenn developed a romantic interest in one another. Unfortunately, little is known about Althea's time in Port Townsend. We do know that at the time, Glenn Bagley was separated from his wife, Esther Mae Gessler. Just 3 years after Althea and Jeffrey were last seen, Esther too would disappear. She was last seen in Auburn, Washington, on March 13, 1976, leaving home in her blue Mercury station wagon. By 1976, Esther had remarried and was training to become a paralegal. On the day that Esther disappeared, she told her second husband that she was going to rent a hotel room so she could be alone to study. While the disappearance of Esther and Althea have never been officially connected, it is hard to ignore the striking similarities. Althea and her son Jeffrey were last seen on March 27, 1973, at or close to the apartment that they shared with Glenn Bagley. That day, Althea and Jeffrey were due to travel to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. From there, they had plans to fly to New York City and catch a connecting flight to Greece to meet up with Althea's parents, who were already holidaying there. Unfortunately, Althea and Jeffrey never made it to their flights and have never been seen or heard from again. Glenn is believed to be the last person to have seen the pair alive. He told the Kent Police Department that on March 27th, he dropped Althea and Jeffrey off at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, which was the last time he saw them. Investigators doubted his story, but without solid evidence, they were unable to move forward with a conviction. While searching Althea's room, they uncovered letters between the two that exposed their romantic relationship, which had previously been unknown. Following the 1976 disappearance of Esther, authorities ramped up their investigation of him. Glenn soon caught wind of the police attention that he'd garnered and had moved to the Philippines to escape the heat. Glenn Allen Bagley never returned to the United States, passing away in 2016 from cancer. According to the Charlie Project, the Kent Police Department tried to build a case against him for many years, but were always unsuccessful. An ex-girlfriend of Bagley later told investigators that he had not been building a cat house on the day of Esther's disappearance as he had told law enforcement. She refused to tell the police anything else as Glenn had threatened her, telling her, quote, "You will end up in the same culvert in Kinseen as Esther." Searches for Althea, Jeffrey, and Esther have been conducted, but nothing has been found so far. In 1973, burned and charred human remains were discovered on Protection Island just off of Discovery Bay. Unfortunately, the chain of custody is somewhat murky on these remains, with the Port Townsend leader reporting, quote, "The remains pulled from the island burn pile in 1973 were transferred to the University of Washington's anthropology lab. It was concluded that the University of Washington had no documentation of those remains, nor several other associated records from that era." Althea Dale Blankenship is described as a Caucasian female with brown hair, blue eyes, 5'7", and 135 to 140 pounds. Jeffrey Dean Blankenship was described as a white male with brown hair, brown eyes, 3'5", and 75 pounds. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective John Thompson of the Kent Police Department at 253-856-5800, quoting case number 76-705. Case number 2, Patricia Eve Gogler. It was on September 29, 1980, approximately 5 miles from Ashland, Virginia, at around 6:30 p.m. when firefighters were attempting to put out a brush fire when they came across the burned remains of a young woman. She was found on a gravel dirt road that would be later named Wesley's Court, just off of what is now Greenwood Church Road, approximately 12 minutes outside of Ashland. The woman was able to be identified quickly through dental records. She was Patricia Eve Gagler. Not much is known about the young woman, but she was 28 years old. She was moving from her hometown in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, to live with her brother in Richmond, Virginia. Authorities would discover that she had last been seen on September 29th around 3 p.m. at a Sunoco gas station in Ashland, Virginia. News reports from 1980 stated that she'd been there to get a used car tire. They would also discover her vehicle on the dirt road near the fire. An autopsy was performed and the medical examiner stated that Patricia had died from an upper airways burns due to immolation or death by fire. They said that she had most likely died within seconds of her airways being burned. They also stated that they didn't find any other wounds on her body, as well as no evidence of sexual assault. They could not determine if she had been conscious at the time of her death, and her death was ultimately ruled a homicide. There has been no speculation if the killer had started the fire or it had already been started and just utilized. No suspect has ever been reported to the public. There is no record that Patricia had been married at any point in her life. Her last known occupation had been stated as a waitress on her death certificate. Both of her parents passed away in 2010 and 2012, and they never got to know what happened to their daughter. Patricia was last seen at that gas station, and she'd only been about 30 minutes from Richmond, Virginia. Law enforcement has always been stumped on why she'd been on that road going in the wrong direction when she was last seen on the main road to Richmond. Authorities have never released much about this case, and details for this are significantly lacking. In January 2022, deputies from the Hanover County Sheriff's Department asked the public to come forward with any information regarding the case of Patricia Eve Gagler. The Hanover Sheriff's Office has asked that if you have any information regarding the crime, you're asked to contact Crime Stoppers at 804-365-6396 or contact Investigator Robertson with the Hanover County Sheriff's Office at 804-365-6396. Case number 1. Sheila Sue Connor. 30-year-old Sheila Sue Connor was described as a loving and caring mother to her 8-year-old son, David. Sheila's life hadn't always been easy, with her son telling local news outlets that she'd been subjected to violence from a young age. Despite her challenging beginnings, Sheila was a kind and gentle soul who ensured her son would never have to face the same hardships she did. The two lived together in Houston, Texas, and things were going well for a while. That was until December 31st, 1991. David's only memory of that day was being pulled out of the bath and being told to dry off and put on some clothes as quickly as possible. Houston police officers crouched to his level and told him the devastating news. His beloved mother was missing. At 8 years old, this was hard for David to comprehend, and it took several years for him to be able to process that day entirely. According to reports, Sheila was last seen at Echo Glen Lane at the home of her boyfriend. The man with whom Sheila was in a relationship was much older than her, and her friends and family worried for her safety. Sheila was considerably more vulnerable as she was battling with addiction at the time of her disappearance.
She's somebody who was subjected to violence from a very young age. And so that led to a certain lifestyle that ended up putting her in a position to where, she was under threat by somebody who was violent.
The last known contact from Sheila Connor came at 3:30 a.m. when she called a friend from her boyfriend's home in North Houston. She told a friend that she and him had gotten into an argument, and that was the last time anyone ever heard from Sheila. She was reported missing days later. When her missing person investigation began, her car was found abandoned and stripped down along Interstate 45 in New Haven, Texas. Sheila's boyfriend has never been publicly named, but David Connor believes his mother was murdered that night. David now works with the media to ensure his mother's name and story has never been forgotten. Sheila Sue Connor is described as a white female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5 foot, and 130 pounds. She has a scar on the right side of her chin and the following tattoos: a leaf on her left leg, a rose on her right breast, and a tattoo on her arm. She was last seen wearing a black jacket, blue jeans, and may be wearing glasses. Her son is still hopeful that someone with information will come forward and he can finally have some answers.
I want her life to be remembered as a woman who deserved dignity. I think she deserves dignity for her story. I think her story should be told.
Anyone with information is asked to contact Denise O'Leary of the Harris County Sheriff's Office at 712-221-6000, quoting case number HC08-008-1890. Well, that's gonna be it for this video. What are your thoughts? Which cases do you think will be solved soon, and what do you think will be the key piece of evidence to close these cases? For more cases like this, click here for our cold case playlist. If you would like to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button, comment down below, and share the video. And if you haven't yet, why not subscribe? Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on new content. I post new crime content every week. Other ways to support the channel are by following me on other platforms, which are all linked in the description box of this video. I've also started streaming over on Twitch, so come say hi over there. And if you see anything you want me to cover next, let me know. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. I'll see you all in the next video. Stay safe out there. Goodbye.